Good morning, good morning. Welcome everybody. We should get started on time, otherwise who knows when we'll leave. Thank you so much for coming. This has come about really quickly, but it is just wonderful to have a room full of women. Welcome to JP Morgan Asset Management. So I'm Karen Ward, I'm the Chief Strategist here. This is sort of my home, this stage here. I do a lot of my day job, so I'm quite used to this room. You'll look around and you'll see it's actually an old boys' school. So I'm kind of enjoying the irony of filling it with a room full of women, I have to say. But we're so delighted to host the network here. Really excited to see you all energized, talking to each other this morning. And we've got a really fabulous morning for you. Shortly after me, you're going to hear from Patrick Thompson, who's our CEO here at JP Morgan Asset Management for Europe. Partly, I invited Patrick because I want him to know what it feels like to look at a room full of people of the opposite gender. But no, actually, the reason I asked Patrick to talk to you is I've worked for lots of different leaders. Some had no interest in diversity whatsoever. Some had an interest in diversity because they thought it was the right thing to do, that it was fair. But Patrick's one of the few people I've worked for who realizes that a diversity agenda is actually about the strength of his business. And it's actually about talent, and it's actually about at the bottom of his bottom line at the end of the day. So that's why I wanted Patrick to get a moment to speak to you. Then Al Medina is who's of course chair of the network. She's going to say a few words about where we are and where we're going forward. And then as we were planning the rest of the day, to me, it's really important that a network event, really gives you a lot of tools to go away into your day jobs or into your broader decision making. I think you have to come away more informed. I think you have to come away inspired. And I think you have to come away with some tips and tricks as well, just for how to make your life better and easier. So that's how we've set up the day. Really delighted that Dr. Swati Dhingra is going to join us. You're going to end up more informed about what's happening in the UK economy. It's a tricky time, I think. So all eyes on her for her speech and what she's making of the UK economic outlook. Then a dear friend of mine is going to be addressing you. She's an executive coach and leadership consultant. I've worked with her in the past for a number of years. She's been a huge part of who I am and where I am today. So I'm so happy to bring her to you and some of her wisdom and tips. When we were talking about her session, we were going to call it imposter syndrome, because when you speak to a women's network, it's the phrase that comes up so frequently. But both of us are a little bit uncomfortable with that term, and you're going to find out a little bit more about why we called it something different, but we're going to be getting into the roots of what's going on there. And then later on in the morning, for those tips and tricks and more wisdom, we've got a fabulous panel of experts, people who've been in the industry for a long time, where we're going to be talking about some of the hacks that have got them to where they are today. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Patrick Thompson, our CEO. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you, Al Medina, as well, for organising this. It's a fantastic event. I reflect on the importance of networking, and I certainly endorse everything that Karen says about these. This is an amazing opportunity, and this is the sort of thing that we're so proud to be associated with. I have a personal confession. I'm an amateur beekeeper, so I was absolutely delighted to see this. And for those who don't know, we've actually put 2 weeks ago a hive of economic activity, a hive up on the roof. So we've got 15,000 new employees, and I hope they're doing their thing on this nice sunny day. So delighted to be here. So we've got in the room today, just so that you know who you are, obviously people from the network, but you've also got clients, consultants. We've got a number of colleagues from JP Morgan from the Women on the Move network. And that is a business resource group that we have to promote and ensure that women get the same opportunities and are empowered and have the same advancement opportunities as the men. And we also have representatives here from men as allies. So those are men. Nice to see some of them here today. I'm feeling a bit lonely and exposed up here. who also, it's an extension of the Women on the Move network. And it's a forum to make sure that we can discuss how to make sure this is a level playing field. My own personal interest in this is, I have 5 children, 2 of them are daughters, and I want to make sure that my daughters have the same opportunities in this firm and in financial services that my boys do. I'm not sure that's quite the case today, which is why I feel personally very engaged on this subject. So these events are so important because, to touch on Karen's comments, D&I, it's one of my 3 priorities. And why is that? Well, fundamentally, it makes us a better company. You know, we know that having a diverse representation and factoring that into, in our case, investment management decisions, leads to better outcomes. And we know that we do a better job and we are more competitive for our clients. So that's fundamentally the business rationale. And so I'm really pleased to be able to, you know, make a few comments on this point and make sure that people understand there's a business rationale here. This is not only doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. There is a very strong and compelling business reason for this. So the agenda looks fantastic. I would encourage you, please do. You've got name tags for a reason. It's to try and break down that awful feeling that you have when you don't know anyone, and try to mingle and make sure that you make the most of this event, because it really is a fantastic networking opportunity. You've got some of the great lights of the financial services industry here, so do take advantage of that. Interestingly, one thing that is, I think, relatively new in the industry is our clients are starting to care very deeply about this subject. When we do events with people like consultants, so in asset management, consultants are very important because they're typically the gatekeepers for much of the institutional capital. They'll ask us questionnaires and they'll send us requests for proposal and questionnaires. And now one of the most common leading questions that we get is to evidence your DE&I policies. Can you show us the numbers? Show us the stats. Show us the impact that you're actually having. And that is used as a determinant as to whether you're going to be successful or not. So that's, again, another compelling business reason. And of course, we fully support that initiative. So really important for us that we lean in on this. We're delighted to have you all today. Do take advantage of the fantastic agenda. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Almudena. There we are, Almudena. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see a room full of junior women and some men. It's really great that JP Morgan Asset Management has agreed to host this event. It's so important for the network that we have support from our partners, and JP Morgan has been pivotal in this. So thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Karen. We started the UK Women in Economics Network in February this year, and since then there's been huge momentum around it. And I think that shows the demand for this kind of networking events, for women getting together, particularly in economics. This is what we are about at the Royal Economic Society. The Bank of England was supporting us from the start, and that was great. So one of the pillars of the network is support. The other ones are network, action, and inspire. But the support network, which is run by Chloe, who has put together this great event, is aimed to people like you, to junior women economists that are starting their career, are facing some of the challenges that some of us face in our careers earlier on. And it's about helping you thrive in a male-dominated world. So I hope that today you get inspiration from other senior women economists and a lot of advice, as Karen said, that is going to be, some of it will really change your career. When I think back at this type of network events when I was a junior women economist, I can now reflect and see some moments where the sort of advice, the sort of mentor that I was given, which I wasn't necessarily aware of at the time, has really changed the way my career has evolved afterwards. So really anything that is said today, even if it doesn't sound important at the time, at some point it will come back to you and you'll appreciate all the things that you were exposed in this networking event. So keep your eyes, keep your ears open and your mind open to everything that we discussed today. I think I have to go through the code of conduct. I don't know if there's gonna be some slides. What do I need to do? Okay. So I'm kind of embarrassed with this audience to be talking about the code of conduct. This is something that all economic associations, the American Economic Association, the European, the Royal Economic Association in England have put together very recently. And it seems, I was talking to a friend of mine in the tube when I was coming here. She's a senior, not female, she's an engineer. And she was saying, but a lot of things that you're telling me are sort of obvious. Do you need to remind people? And what's happened recently, and this is why very recently these code of conduct have been issued, is that we now have data of what goes on in particular in economic seminars in academia. And we've noticed analyzing a lot of videos and, with all the new AI that we have that can analyze that sort of new data, that women are interrupted very early on in the talk when they give an academic seminar, for example, when they give a presentation. It's particularly junior women, and it's particularly by senior men. And also, the power of data and the power of the new technologies has allowed us very recently, again, to sort of document at a great scale that the sort of questions that these women get are much more condescending and patronizing than the questions that men would get, okay? And this has only been very recently because, again, the new sort of data that is been made available to economists and to data analysts, and the new methods of analyzing that kind of data, right? And I think that's spurred this kind of change in the profession that is inherently a very male-dominated profession that we really need to change the culture, and the code of conduct is part of that. So if you're going to ask any question, do it from your heart, doing from a genuine desire to understand what the speaker is telling you, and be respectful to others. So I think that's the background of this. I think I'm ready to introduce my colleague at LSE, Swati Dhingra. We're so pleased to welcome you, Swati. She's going to be talking about the UK economic outlook. So thank you so much.
So let me start with talking a bit about what I was asked to do. I was asked to first speak about my own personal experience as a woman in economics. I'm always incredibly uncomfortable doing that. And I'm sure a lot of you share that sort of sense of reticence about it as well. Let me instead start with talking a little bit about sort of building up to that, just to say that my experience is going to speak to what I have felt and experienced, but it need not speak to everything that you all may have experienced. So do discount the fact that this is an individual view. This is not something that I'm trying to look at statistics and give you a feel for what the average experience is. Broadly speaking, I think most of us, and I've been at a couple of events now where there are issues about gender and diversity at the forefront. And surprisingly, how many people nod their heads when points like these come up, that most of us have experienced that we tend to go invisible in a room full of people where there are men as well around. It's even worse if you have interaction effects, if you're somebody of gender and color together. And most of that we see while there are mediocre men around us doing exactly the same thing, but not experiencing the same kind of criticism that we face. I don't have a better answer for you. I think that's just too bad that the world is like this, and it's not going to improve overnight. What we can do, though, is that people like Karen here or Amadena here are creating those spaces, as well as with their own experiences, pushing those barriers that enable the rest of us to be able to do something to change the world more quickly. So let me give you a couple of examples where I started off with some level of doubt about the Women Economics Network, for the reason that I feel like there are many other networks, and most of the times what they do is actually create a much more exclusionary environment rather than an inclusionary environment. And I think what the RES has managed to accomplish is actually not create that sort of environment, and to keep it positive and to not become an exclusionary force. And one example of that I experienced, and which is the reason I was keen to do this, was a few months ago, the RES, and Amadena was there then as well, organized a very small sort of event where Barbara Petrangelo spoke very, very eloquently about the kinds of distortions that systematic underrepresentation of women creates in decision making. And of course, being in probably one of the most male-dominated professions at the moment, I can assure you that the barriers still remain, but it's not going to change overnight. And if we assume that because of the general change and pace of how things are overall progressing socially, that we might see some change very quickly, I think that's really wishful thinking. In fact, the RES a few years ago, about 5 to 6 years ago, had a podcast with Stephen Machen and Samaya Keynes on there, and the general view was that it would take about another 100 years before we see some kind of fair representation of women. If you don't want to wait that long, now is the time to act, and the rest of us have this responsibility to ensure that those who've done this before us, Mrs. Joan Robinson will continue to be called Mrs. Joan Robinson and probably not Professor Joan Robinson. We've got to change things, and we've got to do it in a way that's not exclusionary, so that we are also sensitive to many other barriers that people face. For example, people from working class backgrounds, that the moment you open your mouth and the accent reveals that you are somebody from working class, we have serious barriers within economics about those issues. So I think I'm not trying to make you feel depressed. I'm just trying to say that there is room, there is sort of that moment historically that there is a lot of support for doing these sorts of events and being able to provide women a safe space where they don't feel like they've been ignored or made invisible, and to be able to then change sort of slowly from within. So thank you all for coming. I know this is early morning, and I'm absolutely amazed. And this is really sort of speaks to how well Marie-Louisa and others, and Misa is here as well, and Tara, how much effort they've put in to make sure that these kinds of events are possible and they're well attended. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm actually really proud to be part of this. So let me now go to the more bread and butter economics issues, which is, I'm going to talk a bit about international shocks and inflation in the United Kingdom. I'm going to give you a little bit the economic outlook, mainly through sort of some of the statistics that we can see already and what those might tell us about the long-term inflationary process. So let me start with talking about sort of what we are compared to, say, the rest of the world. So unlike the United States, which is where most of the debate over monetary policy or most of the literature on monetary policy comes from, we're a really small open economy. We don't quite have the global pricing power that the United States has. We're pretty much price takers in the global economy. And which is why when a huge terms of trade shock, like the kind we've seen recently, which isn't at the scale of the 1970s energy price shocks, but is broadly of that sort of stature, we have to be really, really sort of concerned about how well we can think about what the price transmission of these sorts of international shocks will be through the economy, as well as what the responses of monetary policy will be to be able to discipline this shock or to be able to mitigate some of the negative effects of it. I don't have to necessarily say this again, but higher international prices clearly pushed up UK consumer price inflation. I know this sounds a little bit like yesterday's story because we've heard enough about the terms of trade shock, and now we should turn our attention to the domestically embedded inflation. I'm going to get to that, but I'm going to also tell you that it isn't as though this shock has completely worn off. And a lot of what we don't know about it is because many of our data innovations and statistics that are used, particularly in central banking, have simply not kept pace with the really big changes that have happened since the last terms of trade shock took place. So compared to the 1970s, we don't live in a world where you ship widgets for widgets. Instead, we live in a world where there's lots of global supply chains, domestic supply chains, and there's been a huge increase in the services sector in the economy. That means our production structure now is very different from the production structure that used to be. Our consumption basket has also evolved, but not quite at the same pace probably as the way the production structure has transformed. What do we need? Well, I'm going to argue that if we don't sort of, become cognizant of the really deep gaps in knowledge that exist right now, we'd probably have lost this historical moment to be able to get all of our data infrastructure and analytical infrastructure in shape for the next big shock that arises, as well as to be able to mitigate whatever we can of this shock as it goes on. So I'm going to argue this is the moment that if you want to see change, the historical moment is there, and there have been huge advances in terms of how much we understand sort of our ability to collect data through AI and other things, as well as our ability to think about what to do with modeling, which of course has taken a massive bashing right now, but which we can learn from much of the credibility revolution that's happened around economics. So this is just to sort of warm you up to say how much the scale of the shocks that we're talking about. These are various kinds of shipping indices, including some of them from JP Morgan's databases as well, which are telling us that there was a huge spike in shipping costs as well as other measures of supply chains. And that sort of has worn off much more recently, and which is why we've seen some more resilience in the economy. For example, with the, in November, we were still worried that there may not be enough gas to be able to get through the winter. And that isn't what's happening now. So we can start to think about what does this mean through how are consumer prices going to evolve in the future. So this is just to give you a long-term overview of what the external shocks have done. I know you've seen this picture several times, but it helps to sort of take a longer term perspective every now and then. So this is telling you what's happened from 2019 Q4 to 2023 Q1, and which is why the percentage numbers that you're seeing on the y-axis are really big compared to the, say, 10% peak inflation rate that you're used to thinking about from one particular month. So this is giving you broadly how we can decompose inflation into various factors, which is very simple, straightforward, first principles idea that if I look at consumer prices, I should be able to say that those consumer prices depend on the costs that go into making that product, plus the margins that are being charged for those products. So this is what the bars are basically showing you, that the orange bars there, the yellow bars and the orange bars are telling you what's the impact, how much can be attributed to energy costs and to imported input costs other than energy. So this is coming not just from, for example, if you think of tomato ketchup, yes, it uses some tomatoes in it, but it also uses some level of transport technology to be able to get those tomatoes from Spain to the UK. So we're adding up all of those indirect uses which go into the product to be able to give you the total use of energy and imports in the consumption basket. The final use is typically what we're used to thinking in terms of the 1970s as to, where we buy oil and we use oil to heat homes or to do other things. That, of course, is a much smaller proportion compared to the huge indirect use that goes into, as well as the direct use through imported inputs into the consumption basket. Of course, this is, this wasn't lost on anybody. There's been almost a 2 percentage point increase in the terms of trade deficit in goods. Losing that level of GDP within a short span of a year and a half or so is going to be difficult for any country to be able to deal with, leave alone a country that had already seen fairly stagnant growth even before the pandemic hit. So the next bit, which is the blue bit and the pink bits, those are what many would call domestically generated inflation. That's the wage costs that would go into the consumption basket, both through the direct use as well as through various other channels like retailing, indirect use of inputs, and so on and so forth. Naturally, that's high. And most of the reason, at least from survey evidence that people have given, which is why is it that workers are asking for higher wages? A lot of that seems to be driven by the past inflationary pressures that they've gone through. So there's naturally a lag in terms of how wages are responding to consumer price inflation. The pink bar is the story which many have in the media have talked about a lot more recently, which is the greedflation story. That is it the case that because prices are high and because the labor market is tight, or because there's been fiscal support given to families, that firms have a lot more pricing power and they're simply not passing on any kinds of recent decreases in energy and other commodity prices that we're seeing over to consumers. I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the next few slides, but this is just to give you the broad decomposition of headline consumer price inflation in terms of its various cost components, and then whatever is left over is what's going into that pink bar, which is the profit margins of firms. I don't directly observe them. Most of us don't have that sort of data to be able to really discipline profit margins properly in the data. So this is much more a leftover approach, that once we've accounted for all sorts of costs, whatever's left over is going to be profit margins. So we can do that for headline consumer price inflation. In fact, we can do it for every item of the CPI basket, because there's a lot of detail within the supply use tables to be able to combine that with the evolution of consumer prices for each item in the consumption basket. Now, why should we be concerned about that? Just to remind you, and I know most of you know those facts, but this has had huge implications, the energy price shocks, how those transmitted, and the other imported input price shocks, how they transmitted to consumer prices. And for many people in this country, that has had, of course, dire consequences in terms of having to skip meals to be able to make ends meet, having to basically make sacrifices that we would normally not expect people in this country to have to make. I'm going to argue that much of where the focus of the media particularly has been is on core inflation. That's not necessarily where the MPC has put its attention as a measure of domestically generated inflation, but the media attention has really focused in on core inflation. And the reason it's focused in on core inflation is because the typical idea used to be, and again, this is an old idea, that core inflation strips out some of the more volatile components of inflation coming from, say, energy or food, and therefore what's left over is a good measure of domestically generated inflation. As you can see from the orange and yellow bars and the size of those in core inflation, that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And of course, this is not rocket science. The fact that electricity is used to make everything, including core goods and services, is not something which is very controversial to begin with. What it is showing now, sort of in the more recent data, is that yes, the blue bar is pretty big, and that's the wage inflation numbers. The MPC instead has been focusing more of its attention on services and core services. Core services, of course, includes some of these other very volatile components, so take that with a grain of salt. But the services component and the core services components, you can see that, yes, the domestically generated inflation share is much bigger, but it's not as though it's also devoid of what these other energy and imported input cost pressures are. And of course, within wage inflation, I'm not taking into account things like the fact that lawyer salaries aren't necessarily set in London, they're set in the US. So we might still be importing some more inflation from there, but I'm not going to count that as imported inflation. I'm going to count that as domestically generated inflation because of the difficulty of doing so. So with this broad view in mind, the next question is, well, what can we say about the future evolution of inflation, and why should we worry about future inflation? Well, we've got to be realistic about what monetary policy can do. Monetary policy can't immediately tackle inflation. It has to work through the rest of the economy, and that takes time. Typically, the pass-through rates are expected to fully take their peak effect in somewhere around 1.5 years or so. So these are not immediate things. Spot inflation is something that monetary policy simply cannot control. What it can do is it can try to ensure against future inflation, particularly from domestically generated sources. and therefore ensure against the nominal anchor getting de-anchored. And that's really why that's really the main motivation for why rates were raised in the first place, and why they're continuing to be worked through. They're continuing to be they're evolving still as we speak. So my broad point I want to make from here is that headline inflation has still a huge component in terms of energy and imported inputs. It's not a trivial component. There is, of course, still a bigger share than there was, say, in 2022, May or July, of wage inflation as well, and which is, of course, a lot to do also with the indexation of wages according to the financial year or the calendar year. In terms of core inflation, a lot of the attention has moved there because it strips out the volatile elements. So the idea is it gives you a better gauge of domestically generated inflation. And that has attracted a lot of attention, even though most of our macroeconomic forecasting tools really don't have quite the precision that the media is expecting these numbers to provide. Core services and services, yes, the wage inflation component has become bigger. The profits seem like they're negative, but remember there is a caveat attached here that we're not observing profits directly. So this is a backed out version of what is happening to profitability. And I'm going to dig into some of these issues more. I'm going to argue that actually the core inflation measure, as you can see already, is not particularly a good measure of domestically generated inflation. So we must turn to other things to be able to get at to be able to gauge, to be able to have some kind of metric or yardstick of how future inflationary processes would evolve. And I'm going to argue that looking at PPI inflation is particularly informative. It's going to be informative in two ways. One, there's a very tight co-movement in PPI and CPI inflation over the past 70 years, including during these very high inflation episodes. There is some divergence during the high inflation episodes. And by those, I mean these three particular ones, which is early to mid 1970s when we had the big oil price shocks, the global financial crisis, when there was a time when commodity prices were really spiking, and then the current period, which is post the war and the pandemic. And what I'm going to argue is that CPI and PPI inflation is still showing up, but there's a lot more volatility now in PPI inflation compared to what it used to be in the 1970s when the economy had not got the level of supply chain, production fragmentation as well as services that it has today. And that there is some lag, though, all through the period in terms of how PPI inflation, if you were to think of that as being a predictor of consumer price inflation, there is some lag as to when PPI inflation spikes and when it goes down, and how that then translates into consumer price inflation peaks and troughs afterwards. So that's the next slide, which is simply the headline consumer price inflation that the ONS reports and the output PPI inflation that the ONS reports. This is called the producer output price inflation. So just to remind you, and please don't be offended, I know most of you will know this, but for those of you who might be new to this sort of thinking, this is just to reiterate, consumer price inflation is what you're reading in the media all the time. That's the CPI. And that's telling you what are consumers paying for, say, tomato ketchup. The producer price inflation is what producers of tomato ketchup in the UK are getting from everybody that they're selling to, which could be businesses themselves. So what we can see here is that all through even these very high inflation episodes, there's been a fairly tight co-movement across the 70 years, and there's been some lag between when producer price inflation drops or rises and when consumer prices show the same kind of pattern. Roughly, it looks like it's about a quarter or two, and I'm going to show you actually if you do this econometrically as well, or rather I'm not going to show you, it's in the speech from before. It takes about 60 to 70% of producer price inflation is passed on to consumer price inflation. And usually that the majority of it happens within a quarter or 2 quarters. So we're looking at some lag, and how precisely we can measure this lag, unfortunately. I'm giving you the best case estimates. I can't give you more precision that it's going to be 7 months and not 8 months. We're not at that level of precision. So just to sort of move on from there, what is sort of really promising from the evidence, and just to sort of flash that up again, is this bit here, which is this very, very sharp drop in producer price inflation. And I'm amazed at how little commentary in the media, as well as on Twitter or whatever you want to go with, how little commentary has actually picked up on the fact that producer price inflation has dropped so sharply. Now, the key question, of course, next is, if producer price inflation is in fact a leading indicator of future consumer price inflation, then should we expect consumer price inflation in the next few months to also start to sort of follow the PPI pattern and start to drop down? Now, this is where things become a lot more tricky, and I'm going to argue that I can give you some answers, but I can't definitively answer this sort of question ex ante. And the reason for that is that the kind of data that we collect at the moment and the kind of statistics that we have at hand as economists are not up to speed. They're not keeping pace with the kinds of developments that are making this divergence difficult to, they're making it difficult to discipline this divergence. So just to reiterate, producer price inflation has dropped. And now the question is consumer price inflation going to follow a similar path? And I'm going to say that that divergence between them is going to be much harder to discipline with the data that we have at hand. And that's not true just of the UK, that's much more true. That's true just generally across the world, that supply chain price statistics are simply not collected. So we don't quite have the level of assurance that we would have about other sorts of prices. So what could be happening? Well, there's been a drop in producer price inflation, not in consumer price inflation. So one reason could be, well, those who are selling tomato ketchup, yes, the producers are getting lower prices than they were before, and that inflation has therefore dropped. But the ones who are paying at the Tesco grocery, say the consumer, they're not seeing that same level of drop happen in terms of inflation. One could be simply the reason that maybe the grocery stores are making huge profits. They're not passing on those cost savings that they are getting from their producers and other distributors. That's the greedflation story, and I'm going to show you some numbers for that. The second could be, well, there are other sorts of costs that are at the retail level, which are still rising or which are continuing to pose further cost pressures. Could be through imported goods that UK producers don't make, but that we buy from abroad. That's going to be one of the biggest data gaps that we're going to have, which is we don't know what is it that you might be importing of tomato ketchup directly in the Tesco supermarket, as opposed to what is being produced by, say, a Kraft Foods factory in the UK. So we don't really observe that in the consumer price statistics. We don't know what is imported, what is domestically produced. But what we can say is that at least some of the other cost pressures, I'm going to show you, I'm going to come up with some proxies for that those look like they rose a bit later and are dropping now, the inflation numbers. And there are other factors, which is, say, for example, wage inflation, which could also be driving it, and so on and so forth. I'm going to show you one or two pictures, which will then say that those things do look like there are some increased pressures there, but they're now starting to sort of level off at some point. And finally, what of course this is going to mean is that, we don't want to, of course, already we have the problem that we've got to take a call on medium-term forecast, we've got to forecast for the medium term. We know those forecasts are not particularly good at picking up turning points. We know those forecasts leave much room to be desired. And that's generally always going to be a problem, simply because that is the nature of forecasting. What we can then do is to get much, much more data-driven and be able to have precise, more granular measures that let us rule in or rule out various theoretical explanations that are given. And that's really why we need better data. For example, we would like to have better profitability data so that we can immediately rule in or rule out the greedflation story. We don't have that, so we're not going to be able to do it definitively. But I'm going to show you that there are other ways of backing it out. They're not perfect, but that's what we're going to have to live with to be able to get past this inflationary episode. And of course, going forward, this is going to continue to become more and more important for monetary policy, particularly if we think that in the future, there will be even more supply chain pressures, or whether due to deglobalization, whether due to globalization, pick the phrase that you like most. Most of us don't even know where that's headed quite now, as well as possibly through climate change, if that's going to create more weather shocks and therefore more volatility in salient items, prices like food. So let me now start showing you some of these pictures. So the colors look a little bit different on that screen versus this. So I'm going to go this side so I can get a feel for the rest of you here as well. So the gray line is the one that we're interested in. That's the inflation target, which is the CPI inflation line. The orange line is showing you the one that I showed you earlier, which is the output PPI inflation numbers. All I've done is compared to the last picture, I've just zoomed in on the current inflationary episode. What you can see on the blue line is the input PPI. And again, you can see a fairly clear pattern in terms of leads and lags. Input PPI inflation peaked somewhere in June 2022. A month later, output PPI inflation peaked as well at about 19.8%, huge numbers. And then it starts to drop off quite sharply, quite quickly, actually. And it follows very quickly after the input price inflation drop. The key question, of course, is that right at the end point of the gray line and the orange and green lines look like aqua lines look like they're kind of moving away from each other. And just to give you a sense that this is not just a story about goods, which is typically what's measured in the input price inflation numbers and the output price inflation numbers. Even if you were to look at services, producer price inflation, that's starting to level off as well, possibly even drop a little bit. So broadly, the core movement is there, but it's not quite at the moment as tight as we would like it to be. And more importantly, we don't know whether that's just purely, that's something which is going to come in as a lagged effect of producer price inflation dropping, or whether there are other factors that are going into keeping consumer prices higher, which could be profit margin building by, say, grocery firms, or it could be other cost pressures that have arisen. So what I'm going to do next is to tell you that actually one of the things that is going on is that the divergence isn't as big as that graph made it seem like. And the key reason for that is that if you look at the goods and services that are in output producer price inflation, the producer price inflation measures that the ONS typically reports, those numbers are really, really about goods. It's about, it gets so tomato ketchup in my example gets a huge share in producer price inflation, but of course that's not something which is really a very important sector of the UK economy. So what this is doing is showing you what is happening to producer price inflation for the 85 items that are in the consumer consumption basket. So all of those, so now we basically corrected for composition in the producer price inflation numbers. And what you can see here is that there's actually a very, very tight correlation, co-movement between producer price inflation and consumer price inflation when I'm doing a, as you might say, a like-for-like comparison. The same set of goods and services that go into the consumption basket are also the ones for which this aggregate producer price inflation number is being generated. I want to put in one caveat, since the services PPI data is collected quarterly. I don't have that for April and May in the figure here, but we'll update it as it moves on. So broadly, the first thing to take away is that the co-movement is still there. It's still very strong. It's even showing up in the broad output PPI numbers I showed you. And if you hone in even more finely into the right composition of the consumption basket, that co-movement is really quite tight. So going forward, should we continue to expect this to happen or not? Of course, none of us have crystal balls to gaze through. We wish we did, but given the evidence that exists, I would say that this is fairly compelling till now. And now we need to watch out for some of the other reasons that might prevent this kind of co-movement to happen in the future. So let me now start saying, where is that co-movement not taking place? And the microdata lets us then think about what are the sources of why inflation isn't dropping. So what I've done here is to take every item in the consumption basket. So there are 85 items in the consumption basket. You can look at each one of them and ask the question, has producer price inflation turned for them? Has it actually started dropping? And if it has consumer price inflation also started dropping at this point or not? So we did this exercise last month for April, with April 2023 data. There were 10 items that were not turning. So for them, producer price inflation had turned, but consumer price inflation was still rising. So now the question is what's happened even within that 1 month. And these are numbers from May 2023. And what we can see is actually quite strikingly, it was exactly the same 10 products. 5 of them show up as having turned in terms of inflation, and 5 of them show up as not having turned. And these are those 5 items, primarily in food and food-related items. So food, beverages, tobacco is the main category in which we're seeing this. So this should give you some idea of where are the price pressures coming from. And I'm going to argue that the bulk of it is concentrated in food and food-related items. And then there's some cases every now and then which are coming up, for example, through supply chain disruptions like durables, which here includes, your software as well as the TVs and so on and so forth. And then pharmaceutical products, where for a long time we had sort of seen this coming as being one of the sectors where possibly there was going to be a lot of change happening in this decade. So broadly, here's what this picture is showing you. It's giving you those 5 items for which producer price inflation has started to drop, but consumer price inflation has not started to drop. All the other items, barring one, which is a very, very tiny item, all the other items in the CPI basket have seen producer price inflation come off and consumer price inflation following suit as well. There is some, though, caveat I want to put in here that the 10 items we had last time in April 2023, the other 5 items were also items which were basically mostly food related. And some of those I can sort of tell you even now that those are dropping now in terms of CPI inflation, but very slowly. So mostly out of the 85 items, it's these 10 items which are really sort of where the stickiness in consumer price inflation is coming from. And what do we know about them? Well, clearly the CPI numbers are still very high. The PPI numbers, to the best that we can measure it, not every tomato variety is going to be produced in the UK. So there's naturally going to be differences in terms of what UK producers get paid versus what, say, the UK consumer is paying at Tesco. We can't do very much about it, but I think it's still informative to see where the producer price inflation numbers for the broader categories in which they fall are. And most of them have peaked at different points in time. And the hope is that even for these items, there would be some lagged effect, which would then make it sort of slow down. Broadly, I would say that the fact that it's the same 10 items or the same 5 items now, which have seen stickiness, mostly food and food related, where we of course know there's been even more supply chain disruptions and problems. And we can start to feel a little bit reassured that there's some promising evidence out there that the producer price inflation drop has been broad-based across the consumption basket. So I'm going to show you next, I'm going to hone in on food, beverages, and tobacco and show you what's happening from, say, 2012 to 2023. And again, here the blue line is the CPI. The orange line is the CPI-weighted PPI, which is to say it's the producer prices for the particular items that are in the food, beverages, and tobacco basket. And the blue line here, sorry, I can't really see. The yellow line is the one which you can see, which is total energy costs. So the kind of energy cost shock that we're talking about is absolutely massive. So somehow expecting that to wear off completely within a matter of a month or so of gas prices starting to drop, I think is really sort of not following the idea that what we know about supply chains is that it takes time to transmit through them. So that's the huge energy price shock. As that happened, the blue and the pink lines, the blue and the orange lines went up, which is the CPI and the PPI. The PPI has started to turn in the orange line, and the blue line, which is the CPI, hasn't quite turned at the same level. And if you look at the pink line, that's going to tell you that something else was going on too, not just an energy price shock, but it's almost like there were 2 shocks that happened in the food sector. One was the usual energy price shock, which, food directly depends on, say, fertilizers. Food also depends on transport of tomatoes from Spain to here. So of course it was affected by the energy price shock, but it's also affected then moreover by, for example, bad weather in Spain, bad weather in Morocco, and so on and so forth, which has then shown up in that pink line. What is that pink line showing you? It's not exactly what we want to measure, which would be how much is Tesco paying for imported tomatoes from Spain. What it's instead showing you is how much is Tesco paying for tomatoes from Spain, which it then uses to make its own salad. That's what the ONS measures, and that's a reasonable proxy in many cases of what's happening to prices of imported items. So that's what this is showing you. The imported input shock comes much later. The energy shock has already sort of started to wear off by the time the imported food shock comes in. So what I'm going to do next is, so just to sort of summarize what all I've said that there's a lot of co-movement, and it has been true across the past 70 years or so, between CPI and PPI. The next question for us, of course, as a Monetary Policy Committee is whether that's indicative of future inflationary pressures dropping off or not. At the moment, that divergence seems pretty big. Largely, that divergence looks big in the data because of the composition. Our production structure looks very different from our consumption structure. So when we completely look at a like-for-like comparison, which is CPI inflation of the consumption basket and PPI inflation for the same items that are in the consumption basket, we start to see that there's actually very little divergence. They're co-moving still very, very closely with each other. But that's not to say that there are specific items out there, and these are really salient items like food, beverages, tobacco, things that people consume routinely and which makes up a really big share of particularly poorer households. What we can see there is that their inflationary pressure is still there, even though some of the producer price inflation has worn off. There's been a second imported price shock that has come in. And again, we are such price takers in the world food market that that's not going to be an immediate drop off in inflation coming from there as they start to wind down. So those are the items that I think would be really where we need to worry about, because of course, these are very salient items. So they matter in terms of how households, as well as other, say, even businesses plan for the future. So let me now come to the point that we don't think that producer price inflation and CPI inflation are diverging necessarily because they are so different from each other. I argue that they were co-moving quite closely, except in the food sector. Now, one view could be that food sector is finally going to start to see CPI inflation drop off. What could prevent that from happening would be these other cost pressures that were coming about. One of them, as I showed you, was the imported costs of, say, tomato ketchup bought from abroad, fresh tomatoes bought from abroad, which we're not measuring very well in the CPI separately in terms of domestic and import pressures. But at least from the proxies that we have available, it looks like that's starting to drop off now. We can then ask the second question, well, there's also wage inflation. Again, we know that much of the wage inflation shock that came about, those of you who are here, the fact that you've made it till here means that you're anyway a higher paid individual. And therefore, for us, yes, we can see the wage inflation pressure around us. But for people in wholesale and retail, in hotels and accommodation, where the lower paying sectors are, we're seeing a leveling off to some degree of wage inflation. And those are what's more relevant for the consumption basket. Those are the wage pressures that are more relevant for consumption basket. And you can look at actually Tara's graph on a similar item, which is plotting how wage inflation has evolved over this entire period across different sectors in the economy. So this is now taking you to the other possible story. So if imported input cost pressures are easing off, if wage pressures are starting to level off and are largely a result of past inflationary pressures, and therefore we hope would start to sort of unwind at this point. The next thing to note is the third, the leftover, which is the profit margin. So are supermarkets making huge profits? Is there greedflation going on, which would then prevent food prices from actually dropping? And the reason we care about food prices is, one, because much poorer people tend to consume it more. And second, of course, because it's a very salient item in the budget. So what I did here was to go through so these are the top 6 supermarkets. We don't have Aldi and Lidl here because their company accounts were not available to us. But these are the 6 supermarkets that make up about 3/4 of grocery sales in the UK. And what you can see from here is the definition of sales that's given in the company accounts, the profit definition that's given in the company accounts, and I've tried to be as consistent as possible over time so that these numbers kind of line up with each other. And what you can see is that we're not seeing the kind of runaway profit inflation that you would expect a greedflation type of term to suggest. It doesn't seem like that's in the data. You can argue about whether the levels of profits are too high or too low. Those are sort of longer term structural issues, which monetary policy anyway is not very good at addressing. So in that sense, from our point of view, what matters is there further inflation? Is there growth happening? Are the changes in profits really increasing or not? And what you can see here is that that doesn't seem like that's a consistent story, either in terms of profit margins, which is profit divided by sales here, or in terms of the profit levels themselves, that those don't seem like they're really blowing up. So I think it's not very convincing to argue, at least as of yet, that grocery inflation is driven by greedflation. Now, there are, of course, these are numbers which are available sort of in a very timely way. Most of this data ends either in 2022 or in the financial year 2022-23. So in that sense, I can't give you the latest numbers that would be available, but broadly, at least up till now, even during this very peak inflation period, we're not seeing the kind of runaway inflation that we would expect to see from the term greedflation. So let me start to wrap up. The first thing I wanted to talk about, as you might imagine, yes, the economy has been hit by a succession of large external shocks. And it's all very well to say that the Bank of England is hiding behind it. I think that's not a very fair criticism. There are many criticisms you can make of the Bank of England. That's not a particularly convincing one. And the reason it's not a convincing one is because the transmission of international shocks takes time. In fact, a very quick look at, for example, the big survey of the ONS, which gives you more up-to-date information on what firms are thinking. The percentage of firms that report that they've been affected by energy prices is pretty much the same, whether you look in June 2022, or you look in June 2023. So in that sense, these things are going to take time to work through the economy, and therefore the policy stance has needed to be tightened compared to the sort of almost say abnormal levels of 0.1% interest rates that we had become used to before. Now, this is really designed to ensure against any kind of runaway domestic inflation. But of course, the biggest issue is it's not going to be able to do anything about spot inflation. It's only going to have a lagged effect. And because it's only going to have a lagged effect, we've got to think very seriously about how monetary policy is going to transmit to consumer prices, which is largely what I was getting into earlier, as well as into labor markets. And what we know from broad evidence in general, sort of in typical normal times, as well as in sort of abnormal times of high inflation, is that labor markets typically react the last to any kind of tightening process that gets into play. So in that sense, wage inflation, forward-looking measures are a better indicator than past measures for being able to gauge future inflationary pressure. So yes, we've had huge, large terms of trade shocks. Monetary policy has reacted to it. Its effects are not going to be felt for the next, say, probably till the end of this year in a big way. But there are some promising signals that CPI inflation should ease, and that's mostly coming from the fact that one of the best leading indicators, as I showed you in that picture, of the long-run evolution of prices in the country is that producer price inflation typically tends to lead changes in consumer price inflation. And at least that seems like it's on a time-consistent path. It also seems like the producer price inflation drop and the corresponding drop in consumer price inflation is broad-based across the consumption basket. There's, of course, still concern in terms of what food price inflation is doing. And I think, as a member of the committee, that's something which I wish was under my control, but of course it isn't. We can only think about what we might be able to control in terms of excess demand there. But unfortunately, a lot of where the inflationary pressure is in food, even in food, is in some very essential items of consumption. So being able to sort of really go for that sort of excess demand, our tools don't allow us to do it. And even if they do, they're probably going to have a disproportionately bad impact on some of the middle income, lower income people rather than the higher income people where there's still where you can argue there's some level of excess demand. So finally, I think a lot of the pain and the criticism and the inaccuracy of monetary policy could have been avoided had we had better data and statistics and analytical toolkits to be able to do some of these types of analyses better. I wish I had all of the company reports. You know, I did go and manually handwrite them. I can't do it for all companies, but I wish that sort of data existed, which would let us rule in or rule out the questions of greedflation. If they were consistently collected, we would be able to make much stronger statements. Of course, these are not easy things to do. A lot of people are thinking about them. A lot of progress is being made, but I want to sort of reiterate, if we don't do it now, this historical opportunity will be lost, and at least we should get prepared, if nothing else. If that doesn't even help us this time, at least it'll let us do better policy calibration next time. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening. And
hello. Hi. Everyone back from your little refreshing break and ready for more. Great. So it's lovely to see you all. Thank you for having me. And thank you for your introduction, Karen. I have to correct Karen, though, when she says that I made her. I didn't make her. Karen made her. And what a great person you are. It's a privilege, really, to work with you and to learn with you, because that's what it's all about, is learning together. I hope we're going to have fun over the next 45 minutes. And I hope you will be interested. It will be a bit contentious at times, I think, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. Officially, we're talking about building confidence and having impact. I think that is the sort of generic title, and I hope that that will be something that you will get from this session today. But in fact, what we're going to talk about is imposter syndrome. When Karen asked me if I would talk about imposter syndrome, I have to admit that I said, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of imposter syndrome. And Karen said, well, that sounds interesting. And she wouldn't take no for an answer. So here we are. We're going to talk about imposter syndrome. But as you can see, it's imposter syndrome with a question mark, just to show that I'm still not absolutely convinced. First, though, before we go into all of that, let's just set the context for when I was thinking about imposter syndrome, I realized that it's actually not so much a syndrome, although there probably is a syndrome in there, but it's a spectrum. Like so many things are a spectrum. So at the one end, it's kind of softer. It's, I can't believe I'm in this job, is a sort of humble brag. It's like saying, look at me, I've got this job. Oh, I can't believe I'm in it. That is sometimes described as imposter syndrome because I'm not really in this job. I can't believe they gave it to me. Yeah, that's a kind of imposter syndrome. And then the other one, a sort of collaborative imposter, I'm calling it, which is sort of agreeing with that. It's like saying, oh, I know, I'm the same. I can't believe I've got this job either. And sometimes people will say that that's imposter syndrome. But what I hear from that is more like people needing reassurance that I'm okay, that this job is okay, that I can do this job. And that's completely natural. I mean, we all need reassurance, don't we? And it's just a way of getting some reassurance. And it's also become a kind of a trendy phrase where it's a signal almost when people say, I have imposter syndrome, everybody sort of knows what you mean, and we talk about it for a little bit and everyone feels a bit better. That's one way of looking at imposter syndrome, and it's sort of one end of the spectrum that I'm looking at. But then it becomes more serious. And if you're an anxious imposter, you're likely to worry about what people are going to say about you. That's kind of undermining you because you're not really sort of holding yourself and believing in yourself. You're letting people undermine you. That is a sort of imposter syndrome. And then there's the perfectionist imposter. I constantly feel I'm not very good. That is not a great way to feel. And being perfect, you're always going to feel, I haven't quite got this perfectly right. But that's also a kind of imposter syndrome. And then sort of right at the end, I call it the disabling part of imposter syndrome. And this can be very serious, where somebody might feel obsessively imposter. People have said things like this to me. I feel like a failure. I feel like a failure, and there you are. Everything affects me personally. Or at the worst, and this is also something I've experienced with a client, where he says, I often feel sick with dread about work, but I pretend it's all fine. That's disabling imposter, and that is a time when we do need some help. We can't really go on like that. So that's my understanding of imposter syndrome as it really is, on that spectrum from one end where it's kind of quite okay, you're okay, to the other end where you're really not okay. So I'm going to say something else about imposter syndrome, and when we experience it, what does it really mean? I can't say everything from my head like the previous speaker did so brilliantly. I just think that was wonderful, the way she just talked without even looking at her own notes. It's all in her head and it all just comes out. I can't do that. I have to remind myself what I want to say. So, spectrum. And from there, imposter syndrome can spiral into blaming yourself. And it's an area where we do need to do something about it. So I've learned a lot about imposter syndrome from leaders I work with, and coaching is a safe place to admit to it. So let's just talk a bit about what imposter syndrome is all about. How helpful is it to describe yourself as an imposter? People often say in it in a sort of light way, a sort of self-deprecating way, and almost with a sort of smile, as if it doesn't matter. But it doesn't sound like light to describe yourself as a fake, which is sort of what you're saying when you say you have imposter syndrome. It sounds to me more like something more personal and difficult. After all, you didn't just walk in off the street for this job. You were assessed, you were tested, you were interviewed. You have a demanding job with challenges that you've never met before, and people are looking to you for decisions. But finding that tough doesn't make you an imposter. It means you're human and fully alive to the demands of the job. Doubts and questions are not only human, they're essential for strategic thinking, for testing and developing ideas. Saying I have imposter syndrome seems to me a way of getting in the way of who you really are and who you really could be and how you could really contribute, using your doubts and fears. So I want to look at 4 ways to challenge the unhelpful mindsets that we might have. And then after that, I'd like to offer a practical model with tools for working with ourselves if you want to practice going forward after today. If you find some of this helpful or interesting, if you do experience some kind of imposter syndrome, there will be practical exercises that you can take forward. But first, this kind of wider context. Perfection. It sounds like you don't all know this song as well as I do. Who does know it? Oh yeah, you all know it. Give him a smile, give him a smile. Here's my hero. Perfection versus focus. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need. What does that mean? It means focus. It means it's no good trying to be perfect. It's no good focusing on making it perfect. It just kind of stresses you if you're trying to be perfect. It's more important to think, to be able to think clearly, well, what is going on here? And what do I need to achieve? And it won't always be what your perfect wish had been. It often isn't. But you can always do something. And maybe you'll get what you need. So it's a helpful way to remember what this is all about. This is, if you were to ask me, what is the one thing that has the most constant, helpful effect on my mindset, it is this song. Because it reminds me that you always have a choice. You are never just knocked down. You are never just disappointed. You always have a conscious choice. You can let go of things, the anxiety and disappointment that goes with it, and you can focus instead on what's in front of you and what you can do with that. The song says, keep trying, and you never know the impact you might have. If you try sometime, you might just find you get what you need. Balance. Balance is everything. We often forget that balance is everything. And it is constant work to maintain balance and alignment. But it is much harder to avoid falling into negativity or self-criticism when you're tired or out of balance. And that is how leaders end up getting ill or burned out. We do need strength to keep doing it, to keep bringing ourselves back to our center and maintain our alignment. A senior leader in an international business was a heroic leader. I think he would have described himself as a heroic leader. He was constantly traveling and always taking everything on his own shoulders. He did that at work and at home. He just thought he could do absolutely everything. But he didn't take seriously the risks to his health until eventually he ended up with shingles, which is a very nasty virus that stays in your body permanently. And I didn't say, I told you so. But I was pleased to see that he was finally paying attention to his health and his well-being. And we worked on a model for alignment and balance that I will share later as part of the tools that we can use going forward. The power to clean anything. It's great, isn't it? And this is a real 1940s ad. And it does show you how far we've come since then. I don't think you can say that anymore. Or if you did, there'd be an absolute riot on Twitter. But it says something about power, and it is still, of course, true that it is mainly women who do the juggling of children, of family, of work, of absolutely everything, and how quickly that sort of pulls you out of your own alignment and means that you'd feel a lot of the time that you don't have the power. But juggling and even struggling doesn't make you an imposter. It does mean that you might need to think about the power that you have, and we're going to do a little model and some tools around that later on in this. And this is how power kind of operates in ourselves. This is a really interesting model. I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's always true. And it was developed by a psychological theorist, as he's called, by David McDelland, an American psychologist. And he says that we are all driven by 3 needs. This is assuming that we've already got our basic needs of food and sleep and shelter. But beyond that, we have these 3 needs. First, there is achievement. Achievement, we are driven by, we want to do well, we want to succeed, we want a gold star, we want to be able to say we did it. That is a very strong driver, mostly at work. We're mostly driven by a lot of that. Can I achieve what I'm here to do? We also have the driver of affiliation. Affiliation is about people. It's about wanting to get on with people. It's about wanting to be liked. It's about being able to work with people more than anything else. This one is one that is very typically something that you see people moving back and forth between the two of them and avoiding the other part of the triangle, the power axis, which a lot of people ignore. And I call it a blind spot. If you're not thinking about your own power, if you're completely unaware or blind to your own power, you have a blind spot and you're moving back and forth between those two, affiliation and achievement, and you're not using the third part of what you could do, what you could be driven by, what you could use to be your full self. Some years ago, I worked with someone who became extremely senior and successful. But at the time, she was a director and she was very, very frustrated about her work. She could not get on with her chief executive colleague. She felt very upset that she felt that she wasn't getting the respect that she deserved. And it's true, she was doing a very, very good job. She was doing a very good job at achieving her goals and delivering goals. And she was also doing at the same time as delivering all of that, she was doing a very good job on engaging with people and developing people and growing people. So she said to me, why don't I get the respect that I deserve? And I had a hunch at the time as she talked about that she wasn't using her power at all, that she had a kind of blind spot there. The power access was kind of cut off from her as the way she worked and the way she thought about it. So we did some work on bringing her power back into that triangle shape of our needs. And it was very effective for her. And she started to think and operate and behave in some different ways. And she came back and said to me, the greatest result has been that the chief executive shows me some respect now, and he doesn't give me a hard time, and he treats me as if he, has confidence in me. Well, I think he had confidence in her because she was showing some confidence in herself. It was a very interesting experience, and I think this is always something to bear in mind, and we'll look at this again when we come to the tools and tips for the day. So coming on to the practical tools, what do I want to say before that? I think I just want to go into these tools. I'll probably come back to it later if I remember what I wanted to say here. But here they are. This is the model that I have done for the tools that I want to work with you. So let me just talk you through this model. It's something that you might keep, actually, if you are interested in developing strength, power, balance, all the things that we're talking about. Those 4 areas that we looked at are also important to not feeling like an imposter and instead feeling that you are a powerful person who can achieve things as yourself. Those 4 things sort of build into this. The foundations. You need strong foundations to be able to do all of that. Some people will immediately say, oh yeah, I do have strong foundations. I got them, from my childhood experience. I got them from my family. I got them from my own sort of self-belief. I feel I have strong foundations. But other people will say the opposite. They'll say, I sort of don't have foundations. And that's partly why I feel so unsure of myself and how I can stand on my feet and really get things done and achieve things. Well, if you feel like that, there is work to be done, because it is harder if you don't already feel that you have a solid foundation, but there is always work to be done. And then in the sort of earth around the tree, there is energy and balance, which we've touched on and which I'll talk about at the end of this, which is really important to be focused on all the time. How is my energy? How is my balance? Because you can't really expect to be your best unless you have that. And also your values and your own motivations. When everything goes wrong, what have you got to stand on? In the end, it's you, it's your values, it's your motivation, it's why you are personally there. And if you lose everything else, you've always got that. People actually leave jobs because they feel that their values are not respected. It's incredibly important. We should always have that as part of our platform. But then, you know, you need this strong core to be able to operate all the time. So in these leaves of this strong core, I've put these 5 practical tools that we're going to go through. Self-coaching, working with power, touched on, not my circus, it's going to be a bit of a surprise, I think, for some. Inside and outside, and what's in my hands. So with those 5 things, if you practice them, you will be definitely working on building a very strong core and perhaps also working with more solid foundations. And as you can see where I'm going with this, it sort of stops you from feeling like an imposter syndrome. So ask yourself, what's in my hands? What's out of my hands? It's a simple question, but it's one that's often kind of overlooked. Well, what's in your hands is you do have levers, what you can make happen, the differences that you can make. It's sort of easier. You do have to think about your power, but what's in your hands, what you can do. But there are a lot of things that you want to achieve which are out of your hands. And it's a big difference between them. So if you've got things that are out of your hands and you don't have the levers to make it happen yourself, then what can you influence? What can you persuade? You have to operate in a different way. So I worked with somebody recently who was very frustrated because her meeting with the chief executive had been a big disappointment. He had come in very late, he hadn't read the paper, he was a bit flustered. She was really annoyed about the whole thing and she was complaining to me about it. And she said, you know, and he said this and he said that, and he said, well, we can meet another time, but you know, it won't happen. And she carried on. Well, yeah, that's one way of looking at it, is just showing her frustration and her annoyance and her disappointment. She thought that was that. It was just a failure of that meeting. But in fact, I heard the words, we could have another meeting. He did say that. So I said to her, well, why don't you go back to him and say, let's have another meeting. I'll set it up with your private secretary, and push him to have another meeting and it might go better. This is when things are out of your hands and you can use your strategic brain to push it along or to make a difference. But in this case, she was kind of captured by her annoyance and her frustration. So always think, what's in my hands here and what's out of my hands here, because it makes a difference to how you do it. Inside and outside. Outside is events, people, experiences that affect you personally. Inside is private to you. Inside is emotional and anxious reactions that we try to hide. That's one route to feeling like an imposter syndrome as well. And the result of that, you have imposter syndrome, perhaps, you have inauthenticity of being yourself, you have emotional struggle, you have loss of confidence, and you feel exhausted because it's very hard work to hide your feelings, your anxieties, your worries about things. It's hard to put a kind of pretend face on that. It's tiring. There are better things to do to sort of align this inside and outside more effectively. So how do you break this habit? And here are some ways you can do it. You use your own strength of mind to challenge your own reactions. You look outward and ask yourself, what's going on here? What can I do or say? Looking outward is quite hard work sometimes when you really sort of capture with your own feelings and your own thinking, and you don't realize it, but it's going into a spiral inside your head. And actually, it's really important to kind of turn that wheel outward so that you can see what's actually going on here. And if you can see what's actually going on here, you might be able to influence it or do something about it. But not if you're sitting there worrying or frustrated or angry, because that doesn't let you. So don't let anyone capture you. Everyone has their own agenda. Of course they do. But you have yours. What are you going to do with your agenda? And rely on your values as a solid platform. Like I said, if there's nothing else that you can stand on, there are always what you believe. There is always your values. And don't forget how important that is. This is a surprise one. Do you know this one? I've seen it around a little bit. This one is the one that surprises me most, that the number of people who come back to me and say, I used this and it's amazingly effective. I said, really? Because it seems such a simple little thing. Not my circus, not my monkeys. You say that to yourself in a meeting or a situation where you just think, hold on a minute, I'm not going to get sucked into this. I'm not going to get involved in this. This is really about them. This is their problem. If they're arguing about it, I'm not going to get involved. You have to think in that kind of I own myself sort of way. And they say to me that when they say to themselves in their own mind, not my circus, not my monkeys, it's very effective. I think the reason it's so effective is it's kind of amusing. And it almost makes you smile when you say it to yourself. And as soon as you feel a bit like smiling, then you kind of freed yourself from that frustration or this anger or this distress or whatever you're feeling. It's a sort of a light-hearted thing to say, but it changes your mood almost. Not my circus, not my monkeys. I'm not getting into this. Somebody said to me, but I do know some of the clowns. I think that's true as well. It's another way of looking at that. But it's amazing how that one comes back over and over again of how much people use this and find it effective. I just wanted to go back to power. We mentioned power and how important it is. It's a slippery one because we often don't feel comfortable with the idea of power, the words of power. And these words go back to when the Women of Power list, which you may sometimes hear on Woman's Hour on BBC Radio. It started, I think, in 2013, 10 years ago, and it still continues every year, although it's changed over the time, and I don't think it's 100 now. But so they interviewed all the women who had been allocated as the 100 most powerful women. And while I was listening to that on the radio, I was writing something about power to present like this. And it was coincidental that while I was writing, I was hearing this thing about power and what these women were saying. And so I wrote down what they said in 2013. And this is what they said. They asked her, what does power mean to you? And each of them said something different, but they were all related. And it makes me think that if you thought about all of these, this is why this is a little tool for practicing working with your own power. All of these are helpful in thinking about how to use your power. Power means I can be heard. I think that's great. If you need to be heard, people often say, my voice isn't heard. Well, maybe you need to think about how you can use your power to do that. It means that I can change things. It's about getting the right outcome, getting to the right people. That's that sort of idea of talking with people, perhaps influencing, persuading, but it takes a bit of power to do that. Knock on the door of somebody you need to influence. It's a bit of power to do that. Able to intervene and make a difference. That's even if you want to interrupt something in a meeting where you think, no, you want it to go another way. It does sound a bit scary to do it, but maybe you have the power and you want to do that and you need to do that. It means changing minds. That is a great use of power, is to somehow influence people to change the way they're thinking or change the way they're talking or behaving even. It needs confidence, self-belief, aims and ambitions, and that's true. I think that's the little problem with it, that it needs confidence and self-belief. And that's really what we're talking about today, is self-belief and confidence, because imposter syndrome is sort of saying, I don't really believe in myself. I don't really have confidence in myself. And I'm trying to drive this little horse the other way. That means I've nearly run out of time. Just one or two more things, and then I'm going to ask you if you'd like to have any questions to me for this. Daily self-coaching. Daily self-coaching is one of the best things you can absolutely do. It's really worth practicing this. It starts off being a bit of work, but it soon becomes natural. I have a client who does it in his car on his way back from work. He asks himself questions and listens to his own answers. The listening to your answers is quite important. Thinking about trying to say them in a positive way to yourself in the way that you would to somebody else. And not kind of negative, I did a bad job today. That's not what you're looking for here. Then you would have to ask yourself, but why? Why was it bad? Why do I feel it was bad? You have to keep self-coaching yourself in this way. This little list here, very basic, it's a place to start if you're not familiar with self-coaching. But if the more you do it, and I honestly recommend doing it every day, and it doesn't take long, it's just it's an attitude or a mindset, a positive way, like as if you are your own coach. That's what it is. And the more you do it, the more familiar it gets, and the more it becomes natural, sort of like, you know, brushing your teeth. You do it while you're brushing your teeth. This one, I want to add this one because we talked about the client who was a hero leader and burnt himself out and got ill. This is the model we worked with him. And I think this is a really helpful model because it stops you forgetting something that's important. So, you know, your energy is essential for balance. You have physical sources of energy, you have mental sources of energy. Are you looking after all of those? 3 on the physical side, 3 on the mental side. Some of them you think, oh yes, yes, but sometimes you've overlooked something completely. Movement, for example, people often start with something physical when they're trying to rebalance. They start walking more in the countryside. They start doing some swimming, and that's a sort of different way of bringing in some energy. And interestingly, they often talk about that feeds my soul, and that's on the kind of spiritual side, which we do often overlook. So what feeds your soul? Are you feeding your soul? And if you can keep those in mind as a little model, it's a good way of keeping yourself strong, aligned, and in balance. So, as you can see, I'm not a great fan of imposter syndrome. What does it mean? For me, it's what I've said today. It's more about doing some work with yourself and not just sort of feeling that you're a failure or feeling that you're complaining about something. It's much more about doing the work. In the end, you are just not an imposter, and that's why I'm not a great fan of imposter syndrome. Instead, my conclusion is, instead of being an imposter syndrome, keep doing the work that you need to change the habits that you might have that stand in your way, so you can see the horizon and be your best self. Thank you. I think we've got some time for questions, if anybody has any questions on what we've talked about today. Yes.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for taking the question. I think for those of us who may be more naturally soft-spoken or shy or introverted or all three of the above, like the lucky person that I am, what are some tips that you can provide to make sure our words still carry impact, maybe in a specific scenario, you know, in a meeting, 50 minutes with some really loud voices in the room without having to really raise my voice as well?
That's a really good question, because it often comes up. And it's definitely more difficult if you naturally have an introversion preference, as Myers-Briggs would describe it. I have one too, so I know. And I had to go on that journey myself, that I would prefer to sit in a meeting and listen and think in my head, like, well, what do I think about that? Well, do I disagree with that, or do I agree? But I didn't actually say anything until I got a criticism that I wasn't contributing. And that sort of woke me up that, oh yeah, I actually do have a duty to speak up. And that is one way to think about it. It's not so much about what you might naturally need to do. Like me, I just wanted to sit and talk, and I mean, to myself, think about what's going on. I preferred that to have to engage with everybody else. But it's actually, that's not what I'm there for. I'm there to contribute something. So that's where the little bit of an effort comes in, that you need to do that. And if you're going to make a bit of an effort, one way you can do it is you can plan ahead. Usually you have an idea of what you would want to say in that meeting, and plan it. You can even rehearse it a bit when it feels really hard at first. Get your words down almost, you know. I've done that with people, and it does help if you know what you want to say. Not everything you want to say. Is that me? No, I don't think so. Might be. Sorry, I thought I was on silent. Forgive me, sorry. Bad. I put it on silent. I even told your colleague it was on silent, and it turns out it isn't. Not everything that you want to say, obviously, but a couple of words that you know you've got in your head that you're going to say. That's the hardest bit. When you start talking, when you are hesitant to speak, it gets harder and harder, and you kind of retreat more and more and more. But if you've just got a couple of lines that you are going to say, you just push yourself. You know, you've got to make a bit of an effort, say something, and then you've done it. And then with a soft-spoken voice, that's practice. Working with voices is always practice, and it's always really well worth doing. There are physical aspects of how you present yourself and how you carry yourself. You know, how your posture, how you present, how you come into a room, how you develop your voice to become stronger. That's all worth doing. And there's great work in RADA, the dramatic arts business. They do fantastic work developing strength in voices, how you carry yourself. You come out of there and you think you're a king. I hope that helps. Anything? Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for a really interesting talk. It's been great. Earlier, you mentioned you worked with a client who was a director and you helped her sort of get in touch with her power.
Yeah.
I'm interested, how did you work with her to do that, particularly in the context of her already being in a fairly senior position?
Yeah, well, I was coaching her. I was in a coaching dynamic with her. So that is a different space. I don't know if you've had coaching. Okay, so it's very different. You kind of book it, you know, and you get some slots of an hour or an hour and a half, depending what I can get from the client. It's supposed to be 2 hours, but I never get that. And then you find out what's going on with that person. And it's usually not what they've presented. It's usually something else, something deeper that they haven't really wanted to sort of realize themselves or talk about. But I kind of find out what that is. And then we start doing the actual work. So when she talked about the power, well, she wasn't talking about power. She just was talking about how fed up she was and why she wasn't getting the respect that she needed. But in my head, I thought, this sounds like an issue of power. And I asked her about this and showed her this model. And then she engaged with that. So we did some work on that over a couple of sessions. It just doesn't happen sort of overnight, you know, but coaching is very valuable for developing things like that. Yeah, hi, Vicky. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. I came across someone I worked with quite a bit in government who is rather small, and tended to get ignored quite a lot. And but it was rising through the ranks because she was very, very bright. And it turns out that her coach suggested that the way to do it, and I believe that because I saw it in practice, is to actually make yourself look more glamorous, you know, so that you couldn't, or at least louder, so you wouldn't be ignored, by which I didn't mean in any sexy way, but very good clothes, you know, incredibly good haircut, all that sort of stuff, which made her really stand out in an interesting. I had never come across anything like that before. And looking at her and seeing how she did progress, now a dame, you know, suggests to me perhaps there is something there, just thinking about the previous question that was asked. But it's been very rare that I've come across anything like that. Is it common? Have you ever had an occasion like that?
I mean, so there's two things here. One is about self-confidence. You know, some people put on beautiful clothes, do their hair beautifully, do their makeup beautifully, because it gives them self-confidence. So if it gives you self-confidence, by all means, do it. It's not something that I think people need to do, because I think frankly, I think a lot of people don't even notice that, whether you've done your hair or not. I think a lot of people don't notice it. But if it helps you, do it by all means. But I don't think it's the most important thing about giving yourself more power. Coming into the room and how you carry yourself, whether whether you've got good hair or makeup or not, whether you've got expensive clothes or not, how you come into the room and how you carry yourself makes a huge difference. People see you if you come in with your head up, with your shoulders back, with your eyes out, looking at people, you get noticed in that way. And from there, you have what I would call a sort of platform where people recognize you as a person, you know, a real person who's come in. If you're kind of, whether you're small or not, even a tall person can kind of come in or kind of, you know, like not looking they're going to be sort of overlooked. It's inevitable. That's another thing you can do with RADA. They do wonderful physical work with you as part of that. But I don't think RADA ever says, you know, wear good clothes or get your hair done. But that's kind of personal, I think. Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Emily Clayton from the Department of Levelling Up Housing Communities. One of the things you started with was the idea that when we talk about imposter syndrome, there's a recognition, a kind of bonding, and it acknowledges the weakness in us, and it kind of helps other people who are feeling the same to feel like they're not alone. How would you suggest using the kind of techniques that you've talked about today in a visible way, so it also empowers other people to kind of come to this and not just make this something that's done behind closed doors and then we come out as our polished selves and everyone thinks it just comes naturally?
So let me understand, do you mean how you will teach other people to use some of these tools for?
It was more how we can be visibly using them.
Yeah.
So we lead by example. We say this is a legitimate thing that people have to put effort into.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't come naturally, and it's perfectly fine for you to need to go through the same process.
Yeah, with your team, for example.
Yeah, or with others.
Yeah.
Like, I guess if you're not in a team that is led by someone or work with people who do this, then maybe you wouldn't be exposed to it. Mm-hmm. So how do you balance that? That need to be visible without kind of undermining yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure, because I do think that's very much a choice. So I've seen some people just understand something that they hadn't really understood before and start behaving differently as a result. It's not as if everybody is going to be like watching you every move, you know, and saying, but you're being different. What they usually say is, you're doing really well or something, because they don't know that you've kind of grown up out of imposter syndrome and into something else. But if you want to share something that you've learned, there are good ways of saying that. You know, there is a model is always a good way to start, and say, there is a model where we can use this for everyone to work together. Some of these are good models for how to work together. But I think don't hesitate to just take it on yourself and do it for yourself in your own way. You know, you don't have to feel that it's for everyone. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. One more? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Phillip. A lot of the things you spoke about today was really good, so thank you for the presentation. So a lot of it you spoke about is working within yourself, but what how do you deal with an imposter syndrome that doesn't come from yourself, but simply from the fact that you don't belong, whether maybe
other
culture,
people make you feel you don't belong.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How do you
yeah.
deal with that?
Yeah, that is tough, isn't it? That's the toughest when it's not coming from you. That's a very well way, you expressed it very well. What you said, if I can repeat it, is what do you do when it's not coming from you? The imposter is not coming from you, and it's coming from other people who don't hear you, who don't understand you, who don't respect you even. Like, what do you do? Do you have an idea of what I'm going to say about this? I bet you do. There is that. There is that. Any other thoughts about what you do under those circumstances? You all need coaching. It's take your power. It's take your power. Not my monkey. It is their problem. Not my circus, not my monkeys. It's worth thinking that you have to say that to yourself in your own self-coaching. This is not my problem. This is their problem, because it's very easily it can feel like your problem. That's the cruelty of it. That's why that's why it's no respect. That's why we hate it, and we're trying to drive it out of businesses of all kinds, because they're treating their problems as if it was yours, and you end up feeling like it's your problem. It's not your problem. It is their problem, and you have to keep that in your mind, and then you have to use your power. So in other words, when you hear something that you don't like, or you haven't been heard properly, you put your little foot down and you say, sorry, I don't think what I said was heard. Can I just say it again? That's perfectly legitimate and professional and calm and everything. The hard bit, I think, is not to be captured. We talked about don't be captured by the emotional impact of some things that are said to you, or it's very hard not to react. But if that happens, then you go into an inside spiral about, I feel miserable, I feel hurt, I feel badly treated. And you're not really sort of saving yourself. There are situations where you have to save yourself. And that's where power really comes into it. I think we've all experienced that one way or another. There are times when you have to stand up for yourself. And I think that's what I would say to you. So those are two good tools really for you, the circus and the power.
I think that's quite difficult, especially when you're junior and you feel very vulnerable to speak up and say, that's not okay, or you haven't heard what I said. So I think that's tough. But I guess to your earlier point with regards to foundation, I think that you need to understand who you are and anchor yourself around what your values there is and how you value yourself, as opposed to necessarily being validated by others. And ultimately, if a situation doesn't work for you and you're not being heard, you remove yourself from the situation.
Absolutely.
There are great companies everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. So if it's not working, I think that's legitimate, right?
Absolutely.
If it's not working.
Absolutely. But I'm not saying it's not hard. It's hard. It's always hard. We all have experienced how hard it is to be ourselves in a work environment, and where we're challenged and where we're undermined. It's hard. That's what all this work is for. It's to support you in doing what you need to do to be yourself. And, kick ass, as Karen sometimes says to me.
Thank you so much, Beatrice.
Thank you.
While I'm coming up and introducing the panel, I'll tell you a story, because I think the other part, Jasmine, of what you said is, in that environment, an energy gets created within yourself. And you have a choice to make at that time, I've got my notes, how you use that energy. So a story I'll tell you, and I did tell this when we had the last network, is I was giving the keynote speech. There were about 1,500 people, largely men. And before I went up on stage, one of the men came up and asked me if I would get him a serviette, because he thought I was the waitress. And I was bloody fuming. And I had this energy in me, because I was so angry. How dare you? I'm doing the keynote speech, and yet you assume because I'm here to get the serviettes. but I gave the presentation of my life. So take that energy, don't internalize it, as Beatrice said, as your issue, not my circus, not my monkeys, and then kick ass. Use that energy. Right, I'm going to introduce our panel of senior female economists now to join me. So Janet Henry, who is Group Chief Economist at HSBC. She was my old boss. Fabulous woman. Vicky Price, who's the Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre of Economics and Business Research. Anywhere you'd like to sit? Oh no, I'm supposed to sit this end. Oh, there's an order. Vashi Parashar, she's the Chief Impact Officer and Chief Economist at the UK Infrastructure Bank. And Joe Blandon, joining here, is a Professor of Economics at the University of Surrey. Thank you all so much for coming and being with us today. I did sort of send you out a list of things that I thought I might ask you, but I thought I'd actually lead off of Beatrice's presentation. And with one of the things I really struggle with, and being honest and open about, you know, things we all struggle with, I really struggle with perfectionism. To the point where it's probably most of the time I've spent with Beatrice has been talking about issues with my perfectionism. And as she says, with every character trait, you have a dark side and a light side. The light side is I've got incredible drive. When I do deliver something, it's usually a pretty good standard. But I'm also quite happy to work myself into the ground on a regular basis to striving to be a perfectionist. And I think when it became really clear I had to do some inner work on it was in the pandemic, when I decided that not only was I going to be a perfect chief strategist at JP Morgan Asset Management, I was going to be a perfect homeschooling mother. And I laminated timetables and put them on the fridge, and it was fine. It was all going to be fine. I could get up at 4:30, get my job done. Then I was going to do 3 hours of perfect homeschooling. My children were going to be grateful. It's going to be magical. And obviously within about a month, I was horribly burnt out. My children hated me, and I was certainly not being perfect at any of it. So that's one of the things I've really struggled with. Is there anything, do you, have you struggled with perfectionism? Any tips for how you've dealt with wanting to achieve everything at such a high level?
Oh, yes, I think you could run a whole panel just on that, Karen. But I mean, you're right, we all do it, especially when you are juggling lots and lots of things. And certainly when you've got young children, that's one of those things. But on the perfectionism side, absolutely in your role. And actually, it's something I know that you've also struggled with as well, Tobias. And I certainly had it, particularly in a more junior end of my career. You know, when you work on, you know, in the world of financial markets and you work in economics, you make forecasts. Now, we always know that the chances of forecasts being accurate to the point are often quite slim. And, you know, if you love your subject, and, you know, I loved my job and I really was working, especially during the Asian crisis, because I have a history of working in crisis. I was the Asian economist during the Asian crisis, European economist during the Eurozone crisis. I mean, I was working, you know, and this was in the days.
And now you're the global economist, and we had a global pandemic.
Absolutely, and a war. So, and I always lead them. So it's, you make forecasts and you put your life and soul into it, and you work insane hours. And these were in the days of phones. It was before Blackberries even. And you make forecasts, and if you're not right, and you're always going to be wrong. If you're not right, you take it very, very personally, especially when you get into a blame game.
Yeah.
You know, you were wrong. And again, in financial markets, you have economists and you have strategists. And it's very easy for a strategist to say, oh, well, we were only wrong because the economist was wrong. And again, it was internalizing it. You might say you get areas of this with government as well. You know, they're adding to demand at a time when central banks are trying to slow it down. It's very easy to blame the central bank when governments are acting against it. So yes, and I think it gets back to actually what the coach was saying about the emotional. Yeah, we all make mistakes. It was what I had to learn to develop was, I might be wrong, and it's not like I was doing open heart surgery, nobody died. It was how I had to deal with it. But am I still a perfectionist? Yeah, I'm afraid so. I am.
Any others?
Well, perhaps I'll add something because I'm completely the opposite from that. It's absolutely impossible to be a perfectionist. I have 5 children. Right now, I have 12 grandchildren whose names I cannot remember. Well, I can remember them, but their birthdays is a bit of a problem. So it's always been an issue. So I have delegated hugely. So I've let others sort of make those decisions, learned a huge amount from them. Also, frankly, you talked about presentations. I know if any of my ex-colleagues are watching, or current colleagues, they know the famous thing is how I was doing presentations in a taxi on the way to wherever it is, simply because you can't fit it all. But I do remember very, very strongly, first of all, I tell all my children, please don't be perfectionists, just enjoy what you're doing. And they generally follow that, fortunately. So, I mean, they've learned from me. It was impossible to do so. I once forgot a child's party that was happening in my house. So there are things like that you've got to put up with. I remember this book, which has really stayed in my mind, by Alison Pearson, and I was just looking at the exact title of it, which is called Don't Know How She Does It, which is about a woman called Kate Reddy, who was a superstar at work and was trying to be perfect with her children. And I remember this vividly, which I have repeated to all my children so they don't make the same mistakes, that she wanted to be a perfect mother as well, in the middle of everything else. So there would be a fete at the school where everyone had produced supposedly homemade cookies. So she would get up at 3 in the morning when they're all asleep, take the pack of cookies she had bought, crumble them all up, and then put them back together again in a form that looked like it was homemade. And then take them home, take them in the morning. And that has stayed in my mind. Just don't be perfectionist. It doesn't mean you can't be good at your work, but look at ways in which you can still survive, do a good job. And you probably, because you're intent on doing a good job, even though you've got everything else to do, you probably will do it better than the man next door because you want it to be good, but at the same time, you don't get completely obsessed by it. Because if you do, you'll make the mistakes that we've just been talking about.
Actually, that reminds me of a little bit of progress I have made, Beatrice. I am making some progress. I've started to now at school realize what are the activities that are for the children that my children really care about, and what are the activities for the other parents that the parents really care about. So the bake sale is a classic example. I used to be when my children were really small, having done the big job, making a cake, trying to put beetroot in brownies because apparently that's what you should do now. And turning up with these cakes that were just vile, disgusting, and my children being like, oh, and I'm cross with them in the morning because I've been up late doing these stupid beetroot brownies. And then I realized the next year I just couldn't do it. Whatever, I was traveling, rushed in, bought some Krispy Kreme donuts on the way.
What's that?
Put them down, and I'm a hero. But what I've realized, the other mums hate me because I didn't have a go at the beetroot brownies. But my kids really like the Krispy Kreme offering, and that's actually who I'm trying to impress. So I've started to separate out.
Absolutely right. They don't care. This is the thing.
Yes.
So in fact, I've written a book on women called Women versus Capitalism. My original idea was to call it Don't Bake.
Yes.
So, but my publisher decided that wouldn't sell quite like that.
Can I add a couple of reflections to that? And I agree with Vicky that we need to look at our male partners, allies. The world is full of imperfection, and they move around with a lot of imperfection. Why should we hold ourselves to such high standards? Yeah. We need to work with them and delegate, or including baking. Why not? And from a professional perspective as well, being a civil servant, moving from one policy area to another, one crisis to another, there is no time for perfection. The important thing is to be there to make a difference. Yeah. Sometimes, I hate to use the phrase, but sometimes it works. Don't make the great the enemy of the good. Absolutely. You will miss your chance to be in the room and make a difference. Yeah. If you keep, and economists can do that, let's perfect our methods and our approaches and our techniques. Yeah. While somebody else is making the point that you should be making. Absolutely. Or another tip Beatrice gave me is
decide which bits you're going to be perfect on,
Absolutely.
and then which bits you're going to allow yourself to not be perfect on, which I think is a good tip as well. Yeah, please.
Come in with something. I mean, I think it's a slightly different background, obviously being an academic, and there is no such thing as perfectionism in academia in some ways, because it is a constant criticism. You know, you poke your head out of the door, somebody will tell you what's wrong with the way that you've done it. And you just have to get used to that. And maybe that's a tip for, you know, a lot of people, is actually, if you have failed and you have accepted criticism, then you become a little bit more used to it, because it's going to come eventually. So if you only, you know, if you live in that world and you always get everything right, well, it's only going to last for so long. So you have to allow yourself to fail at some point.
But also, to add to that, I mean, it's interesting that you said failed. I don't think you meant failed. It's through the criticism that you learn.
Yeah.
And this is certainly, you know, getting back to the point about crisis, you never learn anything when everything's going swimmingly. It's often in times of crisis, whether it's a personal balancing crisis that you've had to make hard decisions, it's in every crisis that I've learned more, and it's the criticism. If I don't get a good peer review on something I've written, it never gets better.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And do you think, do you sort of consciously take that moment to try and abstract yourself so you don't let yourself take it emotionally and personally? Like, how do you do that? Because academics are so bitchy.
Vicious. I don't know. I mean, I suppose I've just become, you know, I have the nice thing about academia is there's lots of different bits to it.
Yeah.
So there's some parts of it, like, you know, your core business is to do research, and that's what's going to lead to your promotion and success in a sense. But then there are so many other bits there. Yeah. And for me, it's been about getting that balance between, you know, so I'm not going to say that I like getting rejected from journals, because that's just a lie.
Yeah.
But it has to be done in order to, you know, balance, enable you to have impact and have policy impact and have people talking about your work. It's part of the process. You just have to kind of accept it.
Yeah.
And then you get to do, you know, nice things.
Yeah.
You know, are more enjoyable to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's something that comes, I think, as you get a little, you know, you have to do the hard bits, and then you get to do the more enjoyable bits.
Yeah. On to the next question. I mean, I think probably coming from some of this drive and perfectionism, which I think a lot of people identify with, is the sort of tendency to want to be a people pleaser and want to say yes to everything. That's another thing I really struggle with. I don't like saying no. To me, that feels part of failure. Is it okay to say no to things? How do you say no? How do you take control and prioritize your time? Ashley, you're nodding. I'm going to come to you first.
I've said no to many opportunities from a young age. You know, just to give you a bit of a flavor, you know, I came to the UK 25 years ago from India, and I realized I want to do a master's, because who cares about a degree from Mumbai University, right? So, and I didn't know anyone, you know, I didn't have any networks. So off I went to do my master's, and then when I finished, I thought, okay, I always wanted to do public policy. That's one thing I want to do something in public policy and work in government or the civil service. So I looked up at all the adverts, and there was this government operational research. You laugh at this. So I went through that government operational research fast stream, not knowing that there was a government economic service. And I ended up in DFE, and then people said, "You've got 2 degrees. What are you doing here?" So then I had to go back and do the GES and enter the GES. But at that point in time, I saw that from my master's class, you know, about 80% of the people were going to go into certain sectors, you know, mostly the private sector, financial services, banking, you know. But I knew what my calling was, even though it was a very early stage in my career, that I wasn't going to go into consulting or banking, even though those were very attractive propositions. And I sort of maintained that. I went and did consulting for 8 years, after 3 years in the civil service. But even then, I chose to go into consulting that did work for public sector organizations, because I wanted to learn the tools of how you measure impact and do evaluations. And I came back to the civil service. So, you know, throughout my career, I've had opportunities or moments where, you know, something seemed more lucrative from the financial perspective or could have gotten me sooner to where I am. But I sort of told myself, you know, I want to look at myself in the mirror at the end of the day and say, you know, I made a difference. And more importantly, because I paid international fees for my master's, I wanted to get the returns, you know, use my degree to the fullest. And I thought that I could not go into something where I had to retrain myself, forget about economics and the power of the subject to make a difference. But I have turned out, and it is okay to say.
And scary at the time?
Scary, yeah, scary. And, you know, at that time and recently, before I took this job, I did say no to another big opportunity and decided to do a stint in a completely new organization. It's a startup, and it's bringing the best of the public and the private sector, you know, working with, you know, some really esteemed colleagues from HSBC. My CEO, he's the, you know, he was the CEO of HSBC. It was very, very scary. But I decided that I wanted to learn more about, you know, from that experience. And I took a punt. And I would say, though, you know, that little bit of courage, you know, just bring that out, because, you know, when you push the boundaries and you chip away, you realize that it's not scary. It's not as scary as it seems to be.
But you were pretty well anchored in your core values, as Beatrice had. And that was your guiding light, I guess.
I would say that you don't always realize that when you start on the journey. I do now. I do now that my values of learning and integrity and what my parents, you know, the role that my parents played. But at that time, I just sort of had a vision, and perhaps I knew what I would not like to do. And what and the more I experienced that, the more I realized that it's really important for me to go into work in the morning and enjoy what I do. So going back to your point, Vicky, like without that, my 10, 15, 20 hours, and, you know, whatever number of hours I did during COVID, you know, would have completely burnt me out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I have to say, as a former head of the Government Economic Service, first of all, it was great that you joined the GS, but we used to value operational researchers very highly.
I know.
So just bear that in mind. So it's a brilliant thing that you did.
Any other saying no, Janet?
Yeah, and actually, no, I think that there is a point I'd like to make on this. I mean, you say a lot of no's. I mean, the world of email means that anyone in the world can email you, and you could spend all day replying to emails and you still wouldn't answer all of them. But yeah, career-wise, there have been times when it is okay to say no, because most people will set out, if you're on a career path, especially in the private sector, you should be changing jobs every 2 years, every 3 years, moving on to the next thing. I've been working for the same company for the best part of 3 decades in a lot of different roles. But in some of those roles, I was in them for quite a long time. And, you know, some of it was, you know, if you really enjoy what you do and can grow within that role, other things can take a priority. You know, if I think I was a global economist when I first moved back from Hong Kong to London, for about 7 years. And during that period, I had 2 children. I went down to 4 days a week. Admittedly, I was in the office till midnight every Thursday night. I was still basically doing 5 days, but it was worth it to me to know that I had a Friday when I could do the kids' run in the morning and in the evening. And it was just strict rules. My husband had to be home from work on a Thursday night. You know, he did mornings, I did evenings, except on a Thursday. And you know, so I'd say in your career, don't always feel you're in a desperate hurry. It's much more important that you enjoy the journey rather than, you know, a lot of people, it's just not always about the destination if you're totally burnt out. And don't get me wrong, there have been periods in my career when I've been totally burnt out. The Eurozone crisis just went on forever. And that was the period when I went back to 5 days a week because I was working 7. So, you know, and I was just working, you know, insanely, in insane hours. But it was exciting and there was an adrenaline running, and there are periods in your life when you'll want to progress rapidly and it is about ambition, but there are probably also periods of your life where you can be very fulfilled through your work and through your personal life when they will take priority. So
that's brilliant.
And that doesn't
throttle up,
no.
throttle down. And it might not be children, it might be that you want to climb Kilimanjaro.
Oh, I did that too. I did that too. I took a break.
Dan, it was one of these really annoying high performers. Just really good at everything.
I did break service. I resigned and went traveling around Latin America for 6 months and rejoined. But actually, I did a horizontal, slightly downward move when I moved back from Hong Kong. Sometimes if you decide what you want to do, it does involve taking a step down or a very horizontal move. It doesn't always have to be upwards.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Can I just add to that a second? I mean, I was looking at this question about, is it okay to say no? I'm a person who tends to say yes, if I'm honest. I'm a yes, that's what got me on the stage. And Mary Louisa. And I think I look back on things I've done and I look through, especially, so some things like this or other things, they're quite short, they're very nice things to do, but there are other things that you look back on and you think, oh my goodness, that took me 6 months. What a total waste of time that was. But you don't know that at the time. And you kind of have to cut yourself a bit of slack. And I was really pleased to hear you just say that it doesn't have to be like absolutely kind of, stratospheric rise. I mean, it's taken me quite a long time to get to professor, if I'm honest. And that has probably partly been because of various deviations and distractions, and also following values, values, as you say, that, things that I just felt that were important. Teaching being one of them, to be honest, and those things. So I think it's really good to realise that there are lots of different paths, and you mustn't really see everything you do, which in hindsight doesn't look as a brilliant trajectory, to be a waste of time, because it's all learning, isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, sort of related, did it? Obviously, you're all height of your professions. Did you have a plan? Because I think certainly younger, when you speak to, or I even think about my children, the pressure to have a vision and a plan and to know what you're going to do seems incredibly intense. And I think for younger people, feeling like you've got to know where you're going and have this 4-decade plan that you're on, there seems a lot of pressure. But did you have a plan? I certainly, where I've gone, and nothing was on the plan.
No.
No.
And again, following on, like I came to the UK because my husband got offered a job. I had a job in India after I graduated. So I had to kind of throw
away the plan
and restart.
Yeah.
And as I said, I had a sort of a vision, and I knew what I would enjoy doing, and something in public policy, something in government, but and I knew I had to learn a little bit more. I had to make my own connections. And by connections, I don't mean, people. It's more like trying to understand what is it that I will enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And then solidify my, my intent. I think it's the intent rather than the plan.
Yeah.
That is more important.
Yeah. Or knowing what you're passionate about. I think I've always been a total economics nerd. So I've always found the subject super interesting. And as long as I was doing the day job that I found fascinating, the rest of it kind of worked itself out. Has that been your equal experience?
Well, sorry, just one more point, because we are in the Women in Economics event, I do want to say this, that one of the things that really struck me coming here in the UK from India, where there are large disparities in, in women's participation and everything, I was shocked at how male-dominated the economics profession was.
Right.
That really motivated me.
Use the energy.
Yes.
But it's interesting, though, that if you look at academia, as we've written in another book called How to Be a Successful Economist, since we are talking about economics as well, is that you have many more women in reasonably senior positions. And if you look at the Bank of England, if you look at the Treasury, if you look all across, the banks, after all, represented here today, than you do in academia, which is really lagging behind. And I can empathize entirely with Joe's sort of comments, how long it takes for a woman to get to that position, which is, statistically, it's really quite shocking. But not just in the UK, unfortunately. It seems to be an issue all across. And I brought on purpose, I wasn't sure you can, a little cutting from BFT, of course, which talks about the book that has been done on MIT and the sexism that existed there and has existed there. And the bit that really cheered me up is the thing about poet laureates, not poet laureates, economic Nobel laureates, for example. And it's this thing about one's wife. I'm just trying to find this here, where, was it Hopkins? Where his wife, in their divorce settlement, managed to get, even though he hadn't got his Nobel Prize yet, half of the Nobel Prize in her dissolution agreement. I thought this woman should have got the Nobel Prize, really. I mean, this is absolutely brilliant because it just doesn't really happen very much for women in that environment. And if you look at Nobel Prizes for women, I mean, certainly in economics, it's only recently that we've had some movement, but it's really, really lagging behind. So I completely empathize with this. But just to say, in terms of plan, I mean, I'm also an immigrant from Greece, and we weren't doing economics at all at school. But in my case, my plan was to be independent and to leave the country, which I did, leave Greece at the time because we had a dictatorship. The only thing I was good at was maths and sport. So someone suggested economics, used a lot of maths, and that was really good. And I found someone to teach me who had been fired by the junta. He was a professor, and he did economics. I really loved it, and then came here to economics. But just as I was leaving, the news was that he was arrested because a bomb he was manufacturing in his house had blown up, and he's lost most of his hands. So I then realized that I had done my entire economics A-level teaching above a bomb factory, which was just underneath in the basement. And the guy, of course, was sentenced to death, as you would expect, but it was commuted because they didn't actually kill him. And then in prison, he taught someone next to him who then became governor of the Bank of Greece. So he gave me huge hope. He came out and he was absolutely brilliant. I thought, economics is it. It's full of danger and such excitement.
I love it. Okay, we want to open up, but the next thing I wanted us to do was just for each of us say the best piece of advice we've ever been given, because I think we've really benefited from having people before us. I certainly feel like that. Janet, you're one of them, and many of you have given me great advice. I think the best piece of advice I've ever been given is don't make a big decision when you're tired. And I've used that really frequently. It was particularly helpful when I had small children, and Janet, I remember you saying, you will sleep again. Oh, I don't think I ever will. But don't make a big decision when you're tired. It's been a really good, take a breath, wait till the time is right to step out, do the strategic thinking, think rationally, put it down on paper, think about the decision then. What's the best advice you've ever been given, Janet?
I think two things. If you don't ask, you don't get. If you ask, you will get pushed back and people will say no. But certainly when I got moved to Hong Kong, I was too junior for the role, but I was desperate to go to Hong Kong. This was with my previous job when I thought I was on a plan, but then took a different direction. And then the other one is, and this is probably when I was more senior, is never be scared to hire someone better than you. Hiring someone, hopefully that's not better than you at everything, but better than you in certain areas, absolutely, because otherwise you will never progress and you'll make your life more difficult. And I've seen colleagues in other teams hire people because they were too scared to hire someone that might ultimately threaten their position. But you're only ever going to be as successful as the team that support you and that you work with and that you trust to give you honest feedback and to challenge you. So yeah.
Brilliant
Always
advice.
be willing to hire people.
Two of the women that are better than me that I've hired are in this room, and they know that Python isn't a snake. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's one piece of advice which I find it very hard to follow, and I'm going to try harder, is do the hard thing first.
Ooh.
So I struggle with that. Terrible procrastinator. And the other one I would say is this whole idea that we've really been talking about in the talk earlier, which is about understanding your values. Because I think when you do understand why you do things, it's much easier for you to defend it and to stick with it. Whereas when you've just got a vague sense, sometimes you feel like you're doing the wrong thing, but actually you're doing the right thing for a very good reason. It's just you don't know what it is.
can I give an example of where the advice was actually quite poor advice, but it was the best advice?
Oh, okay.
So slightly, and I think a lot of women in this room will recognize this. So a couple of things. First was, you know, I think it was a bit like the imposter syndrome situation where when I was wanting to go into the senior civil service, the advice I got was, you have to play the game. If you don't play the game, you don't get in. And the game is, and we know in all, you know, as you get to senior ranks, you have to behave like others. I think, Vicky, you were saying earlier how you have to dress in a certain way, how you have to present, you know, basically like our male counterparts. And that sort of struck, you know, that sort of spurred me to think, no, I'm going to invent my own game and play it. I'm not going to play your game. And I'm going to play the good game. So when I enter a room and I am the only one who looks like me, I know that I can make a difference and I can bring a different perspective. Whether I'm quiet or loud, I need to have that, you know, that in mind. So that really kind of, and I always remember it every time I see something that is the same, it kind of encourages me to just say, okay, can I be a little bit disruptive here? Don't play the game that is very easy for you, might be quite easy for others to do, to go up, but change the dynamic. And I thought that was, for me, you know, I still carry it with me.
It's taken me this long to realize, I think, how being different is such an advantage. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to be memorable. And I remember being in a room, you know, around an investment committee or whatever, and being the only woman, and, you know, it's tiring, but then thinking, well, actually, you know, it's easier to remember me because I was a woman, and Beatrice always used to say to me, stop dressing like a boy because you're not. You might as well define the fact that you're different because you are. That was another good piece of advice.
Okay, well, I will add really sort of resilient. Be resilient if you can. So just pick yourself up and carry on, because you're going to be hit by all these shocks. And, you know, in my personal and career life, I've had some serious downs, and you just carry on. But I found that the most important thing, because I was given that advice, is, I think you had asked us originally, but you haven't quite got there yet, network and support mechanism.
Okay.
You absolutely need to have the support mechanism through your life. And very often, this comes from people that you worked with or worked with you or for you. So if you do, and exactly as Joe was, not Joe, as Janet was saying, treat people in a way that that with respect, work for you, appreciate that they're probably brighter than you are, and therefore listen and be humble as well. So again, accept that they know more about things than you do. You can't just be parachuted in as a senior person and expect to know all these things. They know it. They are the ones who advise you. If you do that, it's they who then support you in difficult times and who have this feeling of loyalty. And you have to remember that through your life. So, I mean, I used to go to football matches with the security guards in various places I worked with, because it's normal for me, and that's what you do. Not have any airs, be completely like everybody else. I accept that you being different, the first woman to have done this or the only woman to have done that, is actually quite good. But it also gives you all sorts of weird things that you've got to get into your head and assimilate. So talking about the way one looks, I remember when I worked for a bank first for 10 years, and pretty early on, because people sort of disappeared, I became manager of economic stocks. I think I was 25. And being a manager, it meant that you could go to these lunches with wine in the bank in Lombard Street, which was really rather nice, and then someone I was sitting with at my first meeting leaned over and said, really fantastic, you've been promoted. We're all men. I'm really surprised because the person who made the decision in the end, as far as I know, doesn't really like you. I said, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? He says, it's because of your curly hair. I'm not joking. This is what he said. I was a threat. I mean, my hair, talking about, was a little bit wilder then. Now I try and tame it. But he didn't, it was because I was different. I mean, that was basically it, different. And it took them quite some time to get over this difference. In those days, you know, we're now talking quite a few decades ago, when, you know, we weren't like them. I mean, lots of curly hair. I mean, honestly, anyway, it didn't stop me having curly hair. So I didn't necessarily sort of cut it, but obviously with years one tames it, because your kids tell you, for Christ's sakes, Mum, can't look like this, you know, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, kids, the ultimate critics. I got a jumpsuit, which I was very chuffed. I felt very modern. And then my son said, "You look like you're going to work in a garage." Keeps you grounded.
God, Karen, just to correct, in case this gets recorded, it was Edward Lucas's wife who got the divorce settlement.
Got it.
Just so that we are
okay.
So I had to sort of go and look. Robert Lucas. What's
Robert
the
Lucas.
This is what happens. Robert Lucas.
Okay, some questions. I've still got lots of questions. I could talk to you ladies all day, but questions from the audience. Lady here.
Thank you. I'm from the Cabinet Office. As a woman, and probably also from an academic background too, I often find the need to caveat myself to be respected or apologise for my opinions, or kind of, not apologise, kind of soften my opinions up in order to be respected. And this is generalising, often by male colleagues. Have you felt the same? And if so, how do you, as Beatrice would say, kind of unlock your power and kind of push against that feeling to do that?
You go ahead. I think you've really got to think about what message you're trying to get across. So sometimes that's completely appropriate. But when you've looked at it and you trust that your result is right, you've got to have the confidence in that result and push it forward. They haven't employed you, you know, they've employed you to do that thinking, then present what you found. Whereas if you undermine yourself before you've even started, what was the point? So, you know, there's a time and a place, academic papers for those kind of things, and some policy analyses, and then there's other times where it's not the place, and I guess it's working out which is which.
I think my comment would be, challenge yourself to think, is it my internal voice that's making me want to caveat, or is it really those in the room? Might be those in the room, but it might be your internal voice. And so I think if just get that straight, and then think really precisely about what is my point, make it and stop. It's been another great tip that Beatrice said, just stop talking, women. She didn't say it like that. She might have done, actually. She can be pretty sure. There you go, inside, outside. But just make your point decisively, and then don't caveat yourself. You might be doing it to yourself. Make your point, stop, silence, and even if it is then silence, because sometimes it is, don't then be tempted to, I have a tendency to go, oh gosh, no one's talking, so I'll carry on, because I feel very uncomfortable about silences. I don't deal with them very well. So I think that would be my tip to you.
But I think even when you are quite senior, I mean, the interesting thing is that it's happened to me so many times on board meetings where you'd say something, and when there are more men than women, and then someone else says it, is a man, and then of course this is very typical, and they all listen to that, repeat that, or a man repeats what you've said as if it's something new and it's accepted. You just have to, my experience is you just accept it, you just say nothing. But you know full well that a number of other people have noticed that. So the other thing is to learn the language that's required in particular meetings. So I had to learn that moving from the private sector to the public sector, where in the private sector people just argued. So they would start, and that's absolute rubbish. The forecast you've given us is no good, or whatever it is, because blah blah. In the public sector, it's I hear we say really interesting presentation. But have you thought, and then completely demolishing what this person said. So you learn new language, and I have to say, I think the public sector one is a little bit better because it leaves people at least with a little bit of their self-respect still going, even though we all know what's going on. So just get the mood of the feeling, but don't act differently because you're a woman. I mean, that's the main thing. I mean, if you have caveats because you're a woman, then just ignore. I mean, just put those aside and just. But read the mood of the meeting and say it in the right way, which makes an impact.
Can I just add one thing to that? Like, you know, have faith in your expertise.
Yeah.
You know, tell yourself you are the expert. There is a lot of, excuse my language, bullshitting that goes on in meetings, and there are a lot of people who bullshit with confidence. You tell your story, your expertise with confidence. And if you do it over and over again, you know, it's chipping away. You might not see the difference in the first meeting or the third one. By the 10th one, they will know. And if they repeat and kind of think that it's their idea, other people will start to notice that we will go to the expert in the room, not the one who has repeated what the expert has said.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for one more. Oh, that's okay, two. Try and make them quick. Two ladies here.
Thank you. My question is, I will be very curious to know, because you've risen really high in your careers. And as women, I think one of the hardest things is to continue with your career when you have small children. So what adjustments, what things do you do that help you get through those years where you had small kids at home?
Do you want to take both questions and then we address them both?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Thank you. My question is very different, but it's very relevant because I do actually have a 5-month-old at home. So I'm as curious to hear what comes back on that. But my question was, because now there is, oh, sorry, Nina Scaro from CABR. Because now there is such a concentrated effort in a lot of industries to advance more women. So, you know, if you, it is becoming less acceptable if you're, you know, you're organizing a conference to have all male speakers. So, you know, there'll be like the 10 male speakers and the 1 woman. But because there is this effort, do you ever encounter a situation where the assumption is, if you are in some sort of a male dominated situation, the assumption is that you are there because they needed a woman and not because you're sort of worth of being invited? You know, nobody's going to come, you know, like as an example at a conference, nobody will come up to you and say, well, nobody sensible will say like, oh, do you think you're here because you're a woman? But they might say something like, it's so good to see the organizers making an effort on the diversity drive. It's like, well, so thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm also thrilled with the, you know, the 1% representation. So I'm just wondering if the panel has some advice for those sort of, you know, compliments, not compliments, and this sort of assumption of, you know, did you earn to be here, or did we need to kind of tick an organizer's box?
Great question. I mean, I'm going to pick up on that because I think my children are probably the youngest of here. I think what's always anchored me to keep going, even when I'm exhausted and wondering whether I'm failing at everything, which I think is a feeling that a lot of young mothers have, of just knowing that it would not be better for them. My relationship with them would not be better if I was stay at home. Because if I was stay at home, they would be my project.
Not to mention the beetroot brownies you've been sending.
I would be I'd be laminating everything. I would be organizing, you know, all the after school, you know, violin, cello, piano. And so it's better for them and my relationship with them for me to have an outlet for my energies. And just having that anchor of knowing that fundamentally, if I'd have stayed at home, they'd have left home at 16 and I would probably never see them again. So that's always been a sort of anchor for me.
Can I make a comment on both of those questions, actually? The first question, because I think you asked specific tools, how to deal with it. People always say, if you want something done, ask a busy woman. I can honestly say, as a young mother, assuming first of all, I was kind of quite fanatical in terms of getting my child into a sleep routine so that I could go back. At the time, we had appalling maternity policies. I went back when my children were only about 3 months old. And I had to get them into a routine. So that was absolutely critical. And yeah, when you've got to be productive, you are productive. I was fortunate I had a supportive partner who didn't travel, and I did travel. So I particularly structured my day that I started work very early, but that I was home, and I lived relatively near work, so that I got home in time to give them their bath, read them their story, put them to bed. That was critical. And as I say, I was fortunate, I did manage to negotiate going down to 4 days a week. But yeah, it took organization, and certain things do fall by the wayside when you're doing quite a serious job and your children. I still like to look back and think my priority was my children, my work. My partner came a very poor third. My friends, I was not seeing them as frequently, but I just, prioritized to some degree. And it's, yeah, they're both at university now. I think they're very proud of me and what I've achieved. So, and on the other point, absolutely, the point about diversity, I mean, it has been remarkable. Sometimes I do end up at conferences where there are all women on the stage now. And my own team is 40% women. But I remember when I achieved so much in my career, when I was finally appointed to chief economist, someone I know well, a man said, it didn't hurt being a woman. And do you know what, that hurt.
Yeah,
that did hurt. But fortunately, because I've had knocks over the years, it's just like, no, I'm going to focus on my achievements.
Yeah.
Rather than you telling me it didn't hurt because you're a woman and the other person was a man. With experience, you rise above it. You embrace the fact that being different, maybe over the years, has at times been an advantage. So focus on the positives. Try not to get dragged down by things you associate with being negative.
Well, I would say, Nina, on your question, just accept it. It's better that we are on stage than not. It's going to change over a period of time, but there are some advantages. The fact that they need to have more women on radio stations, television stations. I mean, a number of us have experienced that. They want a woman to comment, and then the voices get heard more. Things take time. There is no doubt about that. So don't just grab any advantage. If it is there because you're the woman to fill in the woman's spot, just do it. So the thing is not to, it will improve. That would be my view. On the children front, the interesting thing is that things haven't really, we think they've changed, but they haven't really. A recent survey suggested that a third of HR interviews that are done still now of women ask them how they will look after their children, or if they have children, a third, even though it's illegal. And the other interesting thing is that it's having children in a continuous basis. So a number of us have had more than one. The survey also indicated that having the first child now is perfectly accepted by a firm. Everyone puts up with it and everyone helps. Having a second one is beginning to get resented in the same place. It's really interesting. And probably I had sensed it back in all those centuries ago. So I had each child in a different place. So I wouldn't be seen as a constant producing machine. And it's interesting how it works because nobody realized anything else. They say, oh, a legend. Wow, she's working. She's still pregnant. She's so pregnant and still working. So there is that. But the other thing is you do lose a certain amount. There is no doubt. If you carry on working, do other things, the perfectionism we talked about before. And I do remember coming back from one holiday, or one work thing where the headmistress rang me up to say that how my little girl was captaining the whatever team, and could I pick her up from school a bit late? And I had never picked her up from school ever. And I said, this sounds very good, but I'm in Bangladesh. And so she went into a complete sort of thing. And then I returned from that trip, and my youngest was in some sort of play thing in the middle of the crescent there where I live, and saw me come out of the taxi, and in front of everybody, about everybody who lives there, she came to greet me with her arms outstretched, shouting, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." So she got completely confused. She confused me with her, I don't know what she thought I was, but she called me Daddy in front of everybody, which I was happily married at the time, so there was no real reason for that, but she had completely forgotten, the sex difference between the two of us, and assumed there's a parent there, and called me that. I didn't know where to hide, as you can imagine. So there are some, they still tell me off about this, my kids, but you do lose, without any doubt, a bit. Maybe that you've spared them, of course, having been, not being there and being very strict with them otherwise, but but you've got to put up with it. Yes, you do lose. You get on planes and you cry your eyes out because you've left your little child behind and you won't see them for a bit. And that is part of what we've all had to deal with. Whereas what you think is that men don't really quite go through this, but I'm sure loads of them do too.
Yeah, absolutely. The red light's been blinking at us for a while, so I feel like we should probably close there. So thank you all so much for coming and sharing your wisdom today. I certainly have found it really helpful. I'm sure everyone in the room has. If we could round of applause. And then I'm going to hand over to Tara, who's going to do our close, and then look forward to having lunch with you all shortly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you to the amazing panel. I'm sure you all agree with me that we've been really treated to a lot of wisdom, a lot of experience, and generosity in terms of sharing your personal ideas and thoughts. It's been just an amazing morning, hasn't it? I've certainly enjoyed it a lot. It's been so inspiring to see the number of people sharing in what really is becoming a movement to bring women together, women and men, I guess, but to really progress the idea that there are women economists, we can make a difference, and we can also make all of our lives a little bit better and a little bit easier by working together and supporting each other. I hope you've all taken at least one thing away from today that you can go and actually implement. There's been some fantastic content from Swati, some amazingly thought-provoking and useful tools from the coach, and of course all the panelists sharing in their experiences, I think, have really embodied what I think it is to support other people, which is to show your vulnerability and to share your experiences so that others can learn from them, and not pretend to be perfect and not pretend to be someone you're not. I also have been amazed and also really pleased to see the diversity within the women in this room. Not everybody is the same at all, and I think that's a richness, and it's sometimes a source of confusion because we sort of tend to think in stereotypes, and a lot of other people tend to think in stereotypes. Well, you don't have to be like any other woman either. You can be you. And then you just pick up the best pieces and you get the best networks to support you. So I think that's been really, really inspiring today. I was extremely honored to be asked to be the ambassador for the Women in Economics Network. There's first of all so much that economics can do to make the world a better place. And there's so much that women in economics can do to make not just the world, but also economics a better place. And there's still, as we heard earlier today, so much more work to do, that it's really pleasing to see this movement come together. Now, the Royal Economic Society is really, really committed to the cause, but we couldn't do it without all of you in the room. We couldn't do it without Karen and others offering to host events. We couldn't do it without some people coming forward with core funding. We couldn't do it without all the wonderful volunteers we work with. So if you feel that you or your organization can support this network, can support the work that we're doing, and can build on the momentum that we hope we now have, please come forward and share that with us, and we'll be able to work together to make it even bigger and even better and sustain it over many, many years. There will be a survey after this event, so I hope you also take time to fill in the feedback survey so we can make these events better and tailor them to everybody's needs. And the only other thing that remains to be said is thank you so much to Karen and JP Morgan Asset Management for hosting today. I hope you have a chance to stay and network and enjoy the lunch that is to come. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved behind the scenes as well. Huge amount of work. Thank you for putting it all together. Thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks.